long before the world named it Byzantium, and even longer before emperors in jeweled robes paced its marble corridors. There was only a whisper, something ancient stirring beneath the soil where the Bosphorus kissed the edge of the known world. The land here was soft with morning fog, and the air carried the scent of sea salt, pine resin, and whetstone. Shepherds once stood on these hills, staff in hand, watching the slow, deliberate movement of clouds drifting above the water. They would say the earth breathed beneath them, that there were gods sleeping underfoot. Long after the fires of Troy dimmed and the wolves of the Palatine Hill faded into story, this place waited as if it had been promised something not yet born. The Greeks called it Byzantine, a quiet trading outpost between two seas, where weary sailors tied their boats to creaking docks and shared news beneath the low lantern light of taverns built of wood and stone. But even then, it felt older than its name. Its winds seemed to hum in languages long forgotten, and the rocks underfoot bore marks no one could read. As the Roman sun began to sink in the west, weary from decadence and division, eyes turned eastward. The Western Empire was crumbling not in flames, but in silence. Provinces broke away like leaves in autumn, drifting into barbarian hands. And in this moment of despair, a new dream emerged that Rome, eternal Rome, might yet live again. Not in the old bones of the Tiber, but here in this place of fog and promise. The Emperor Constantine saw it, or perhaps he heard it first, that whisper rising from the water's edge. He claimed it was a vision, a sign from the divine. He saw a city bathed in golden light, unconquerable, radiant, chosen, and so he built it, stone by stone, vision by vision. He called it Nova Roma, New Rome, though it would come to bear his name, Constantinople. It rose from the dust not like a new city, but like a memory remembered. It didn't grow. It revealed itself, as though it had been waiting all along. The roads widened. Pillars lifted the heavens on carved marble shoulders. Statues of long-dead gods were dragged from temples and placed on pedestals to stare eternally over streets now lined with colonnades. The old gods were not worshipped, but they were not destroyed either. They lingered, silent but watchful. The city became a mosaic of what was and what would be Christian symbols, etched beside pagan faces, Latin scrolls coiled next to Greek tongues, and in the center of it all, Constantine in purple, his eyes fixed beyond time, imagining a throne that would outlive empires. He laid down the million, that sacred stone from which all distances would be measured. He built the great palace like a reflection of heaven, and he placed churches like constellations across the city's 7 hills. But even as domes rose and gold glittered beneath the Anatolian sun, something quieter was also being born, an idea that this city was not simply another Rome, but a different one. Rome had been wolves and war, blood and ambition. Constantinople would be silk and incense, scripture and secret. The laws would come from Justinian's hand, but the dream itself began with Constantine. And oh, what a dream it was. Imagine, if you can, the scent of the harbor at dawn, fish oil, tar, and the perfume of crushed myrtle. Picture the clink of sandals on mosaic tiles, the rustle of robes brushed with dust from Syria, Egypt, and Africa. Hear the soft murmur of prayers slipping through the city like smoke, the chants of monks echoing through basilicas, and the distant toll of a bronze bell calling the faithful to light. This was not a city, it was a liturgy, and yet, within it pulsed a quiet fear that it might all be undone. The East was never safe. Beyond the Taurus mountains, beyond the shimmering deserts, empires stirred, Persia, the Huns, the tribes of the Caucasus, and so Constantinople wrapped herself in walls, not one, but 3 thick and tall, layered like time itself, the Theodosian walls. They would come to be called, built not only of stone, but of desperation and pride. Behind them, emperors could sleep, if not peacefully, then at least protected. Inside those walls, life took on a rhythm as intricate as the gold leaf that lined the Gospels. The court grew elaborate. Protocols multiplied like vines. To see the emperor was to enter a theater of divinity. He was not simply ruler, he was God's shadow on earth. Draped in purple, unseen but omnipresent, He ruled from a throne that glimmered like firelight, and around him swirled the rituals of a world that no longer believed in mere mortals. Even time bent to the emperor's will. The years were no longer counted by consuls or lunar cycles, but by reigns. Each emperor stretched time like a thread, weaving himself into the fabric of eternity. Some would pull the thread tight, others would let it fray, and yet still, the city endured, by torchlight and treaty, by betrayal and baptism. Ships came and went, their hulls heavy with spices, silk, slaves, and stories. In darkened halls, scribes copied out treaties while spies whispered behind tapestries. The emperor watched it all, or was watched by it, for the palace was a labyrinth, and in that labyrinth, power had many faces, but the people knew. They lit candles to saints, hung charms against the evil eye, prayed beneath crumbling frescoes of Christ and Mary, and whispered that the city was protected not just by walls or armies, but by something older, something unseen. They believed an angel stood watch at the gates, that so long as the Hagia Sophia stood, the city would not fall, and so it remained golden, trembling, waiting, not Rome, never Rome, but something else, something softer, stranger, a city caught between worlds, between centuries, between heaven and earth, and in its silence, even the wind seemed to pause to listen. In the pale hush of early morning, before the muezzin ever rose, before bells ever tolled, the city shimmered with the echo of robes dragging across marble, and in that stillness velvet, untouched, one could almost hear the rustling breath of emperors long past, their names now tangled in memory and incense. Cloaked in purple, a color reserved only for the divine, they walked not as men, but as echoes of prophecy. To be emperor in Constantinople was not merely to govern, it was to embody something beyond flesh, to become a symbol etched in time. The people did not always see them. The emperors were hidden behind veils, behind jeweled screens, behind courtiers who spoke with folded hands and quiet precision. But still, their presence loomed like the golden light that spilled through stained glass in the afternoon. There was a weight to the air when an emperor passed, even if unseen, as though history itself held its breath. One could feel it in the click of boots on polished floors, in the hush that spread through the crowd when a purple-robed figure appeared at a window. And when they spoke, which was rare, their words felt carved, not spoken. Their faces were stoic masks, trained from youth to reveal nothing but certainty. They did not smile easily. They did not weep. They were marble, and yet they bled when the throne turned cruel. Many had risen to it with dreams and left it in silence, their bodies dragged behind closed doors, their eyes never meeting the sun again. For the throne did not forget weakness, nor did it forgive ambition poorly played. The great palace was no place for innocence. Children were raised in its courtyards with tutors and soldiers and whispers. They learned not only scripture, but strategy. They memorized genealogies like prayers, knowing that every name, every cousin, every uncle might one day mean death or power. They practiced the art of stillness, of watching without being seen. And when at last the crown touched their head, not laid gently, but pressed down with weight, they understood what it meant to wear prophecy on their brow. The crown itself was not just gold, it was history. Pearls from distant islands, sapphires plucked from Persian treasure hoards, tiny crosses forged from melted idols. It sat heavy, as though the past leaned upon their skull, and yet, even with all its burden, it gleamed. For there was beauty in the Byzantine throne, terrible, intricate beauty. An emperor could sit in the Chrysotriclinos, the golden throne room, beneath a domed ceiling that shimmered like dawn, while automata golden birds and lions chirped and growled in mechanical reverence. The throne itself could rise, silently, as if lifted by invisible hands, and courtiers would fall to the floor, not in fear, but in awe. This was spectacle by design. The emperor was not merely to be obeyed, he was to be seen as unreachable, untouchable, almost unreal, a living icon, a glimpse of heaven on earth. And for many years, the people believed it, not because they were naive, but because belief gave shape to life. To live in Constantinople was to live inside a story sacred, winding, half true, and wholly necessary. The streets themselves whispered of emperors. Mosaics in churches showed them standing beside Christ, crowned not by man, but by angelic hand. Coins bore their profile beside symbols of divine authority, a cross, a dove, a flaming sword. Their laws governed the empire, but their images governed the soul. And yet, for all their majesty, emperors were mortal, beneath the purple, skin bruised, under the crowns, heads bowed in private doubt. Some ruled with wisdom and restraint, others with fire and cruelty. There were emperors who built hospitals, fed the poor, bathed the feet of the sick, and there were others who blinded their brothers, drowned generals in sacks, and turned the palace into a labyrinth of betrayal. The line between saint and tyrant was thin, and often the same man danced across both sides. The city saw it all and forgot nothing. Each emperor added a page to a story written not in books, but in marble, ritual, and blood. The chronicles would record their deeds, but the stones would remember their footsteps. And always, always, prophecy lingered. For Constantinople was a city of signs. It was said that the emperor's fate could be read in the flight of birds, in the flicker of candle flames during Mass, in the dreams of monks and the tremble of relics. Holy men would rise from the desert with wild eyes, proclaiming visions. Some emperors welcomed them, others had them imprisoned or worse, but none ignored them. To rule here was to live in the shadow of the unseen, to wonder if each decision echoed in eternity. And so, within the palace, decisions were made slowly. Councils gathered beneath painted ceilings. Eunuchs moved like ghosts, carrying sealed letters and silent glances. The Empress, too, wielded power often unseen, but formidable. Some, like Theodora, would rise from the dust of the circus to shape the fate of empires. Others would guide their sons with gentle firmness or cold precision. They embroidered not only tapestries, but the future. Beyond the palace walls, the people waited. They told stories in courtyards and bakeries, stories of emperors who disguised themselves to walk among the poor, who healed the sick with a touch, who cursed the unrighteous with a look. Whether true or not mattered little. The empire needed its myths. They gave shape to time, to suffering, to hope. A child born in Constantinople might not remember the name of his emperor, but he would know how to bow before his image. He would learn which finger to use when crossing himself. He would know that purple was sacred, and that the emperor was more than a man, he was the rhythm of life. The court calendar governed not only politics, but seasons, feasts, even when to plant and harvest. And yet, behind all this choreography, there pulsed something tender, the desire to endure, to hold back the darkness just a little longer, to believe that, though Rome had fallen in the West, it lived on here not merely as architecture or army, but as idea. The Byzantines never called themselves Byzantine. They were Romans, always Romans. Even when the language shifted from Latin to Greek, even when the world forgot, they held the torch, and the emperors veiled, and veiled again were its flame. Stone by stone, the walls grew not just walls of defense, but of identity. The Theodosian walls, begun in the early 5th century, didn't simply guard a city, they cradled a civilization. They rose in layers like history itself. Outer wall, inner wall, and the moat beyond. A triple barrier against chaos. No mere piles of rock, but vast thoughtful constructions, punctuated by watchtowers, gates, and quiet arches through which morning light would filter like a soft promise. Imagine them newly built, golden in the sunlight, their white limestone and red brick still untouched by siege or weather, gleaming above the sea of Marmara like the hem of a celestial robe. Workers hauled stone and poured sweat into mortar, while engineers adjusted angles to better repel invaders and hold fast beneath the weight of time. And within those walls, life unfolded like a slow and sacred manuscript. Gardens bloomed behind fortress stones. Children laughed in alleyways. The call of fruit sellers mixed with the bells of processions. It was a world at once sacred and mundane, where emperors held divine right, and yet bakers still rose before dawn to knead dough in the silence. It was a city of paradox eternal, yet always changing, holy, yet full of rumors and schemes. But it endured. and the walls became its skin, holding in centuries of breath. The people believed in those walls, and why wouldn't they? They had withstood invaders that had toppled other capitals with ease. The Goths, the Avars, the Persians all had come with fire and fury, and all had left with nothing but ash and defeat. Even when entire empires fell elsewhere, Constantinople stood like a stubborn dream. Behind its defenses, the emperors could envision more than survival, they could imagine rebirth. One of them, perhaps the most ambitious of all, dreamed not only of protecting Byzantium, but of reuniting the broken world, Justinian. His name would be spoken in every cloister, etched in marble, remembered in law. He was not born into power, but clawed his way toward it, a man of fierce will and sharper vision. And with him came a fire that would briefly make the empire blaze like a dying star, flaring in sudden brilliance. Under Justinian, old Rome trembled not with fear, but with recognition. The armies marched west, reclaiming land piece by piece, North Africa, Italy, even parts of Spain. It was a resurrection, a reaching hand back across centuries, grasping at what had been lost. Belisarius, his general, became a legend, a man both feared and admired. His name murmured beside candle flames in distant provinces. With sword and flame, they stitched fragments of the old empire into something briefly whole. But conquest was only half of Justinian's vision. His real ambition lived in stone and silence. It took form in the greatest church the world had ever seen. Hagia Sophia, holy wisdom, not merely a building, but an act of devotion, a monument to divine presence on earth. When it was completed, after only 5 years of frenzied labor, even the emperor is said to have whispered, "Solomon, I have surpassed thee." One can still imagine the first light pouring through the dome, not merely a beam, but a hush of gold that seemed to descend from heaven itself. The dome did not rise, it floated, suspended not just by pillars, but by faith. The mosaics had not yet been added, but already the air trembled with sacred presence. Priests walked barefoot across marble veins, incense curled like script in the air, and above it all, that dome vast, impossible, like an eye gazing gently from eternity. Within Hagia Sophia, Justinian placed his empire's soul, but outside, the world still turned. His reign brought not only splendor, but also fire. In 532, the Nika riots erupted, a storm of fury from the Hippodrome, sparked by factional tensions but ignited by deeper resentments. The city burned, palaces and churches crumbled, smoke blackened the sky. For a moment, the emperor's throne itself trembled. Many counseled flight, but Theodora, his wife born from the humblest of origins, once an actress in the circus, refused. Her words were cold and clear, etched in the marble of time. Royal purple makes a fine shroud, and so they stayed, and so they crushed the revolt. Thousands died. Blood watered the stones. The palace walls echoed with the weight of decision. And when the smoke cleared, a new city emerged, not entirely different, but scarred, wiser, more enduring. For every time Constantinople burned, it rose again, as if the fire only purified what was already eternal. Justinian's hand extended not only through armies and architecture, but also into law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, a codification of Roman law, became his true legacy. Long after emperors vanished and empires crumbled, this legal code would live, shaping courts in lands he never knew. Through ink and parchment, his voice whispered across centuries. Yet even for Justinian, the light dimmed. The plague came silent, unseen, a breath that swept through the streets and left the city gasping. Corpses piled, the bells rang endlessly. No walls could keep out that shadow, and so the dream of universal empire faltered. The borders shrank again. The west slipped from Byzantine fingers like grains of sand. But the city remained. It always remained. And the walls, though weathered, still stood. Inside, life returned slowly. The baths reopened. The markets bustled. The fountains flowed with wine on feast days. And beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, choirs sang once more. The emperor, now older, quieter, looked not toward conquest, but toward legacy. He died with a crown still on his brow, his empire both larger and smaller than when he began. He had tried to gather the broken pieces of Rome and make them whole. He had succeeded, if only briefly, but even that brief brilliance would be enough to echo across time. And so the city moved forward, wrapped in gold and memory, a place where ambition and devotion danced in marble corridors. The next emperors would walk through halls built by Justinian, pray beneath domes he raised, and feel the echo of his dream beneath their feet. The city did not forget, the stones did not forget, and neither would the world. It is said that beneath every empire lies the silent labor of its women, and in Constantinople, that silence often wore the name Theodora. Her name lingers in the dust of mosaic tiles, her gaze forever fixed in gold and glass, set beside her husband Justinian in a portrait that has outlived dynasties. But Theodora was not merely a consort, not a shadow trailing behind a sovereign. She was storm and fire, veiled in velvet. Her voice, shaped in the rough edges of performance and poverty, became a blade sharper than the polished swords of courtiers, born of the circus, raised among acrobats and actresses. Theodora knew the stage, and the palace was merely another its curtains woven in silks, its scripts written in decree and ceremony. From within the great halls of power, she moved like a quiet current, directing the course of empire without raising her voice. She shaped policies on the rights of women, the dignity of the poor, the protections for the vulnerable. While scribes and priests debated doctrine in distant chapels, Theodora's hands guided the ink that wrote new laws. And still, her presence was subtle, never loud, like the soft drape of the curtain before the chariot races. She moved just before the thunder struck. Beside her, Justinian carved stone and empire, but behind him, Theodora carved conviction often unseen, but always felt. The city, with its honey-colored domes and streets echoing with sandal taps, knew her name in whispers. Not everyone loved her. Many feared her, but all understood she was necessary. A woman of impossible contradictions, both devout and sharp, both gentle and unyielding. In her eyes, one could see the stillness of a nun and the heat of an empress who remembered hunger. And though she died before Justinian, her shadow lingered. Her tomb didn't silence her. Her mosaics did not freeze her. She breathed through centuries, not in myth, but in law, in the very structure of the city, even long after her passing. Little girls in Constantinople heard her name when they asked who once changed the law so they might speak, own, resist. The Hagia Sophia, her great echoing cathedral, carried the smoke of her prayers into the arches above, where angels turned their golden faces toward heaven. But the world beyond Constantinople's walls did not sleep, and history, ever moving, crept toward the empire's heart with dust on its boots. From deserts and mountains came new voices, new faiths, rising not with swords at first, but with words. Revelations carried across wind and sand. Islam, a rising tide from the Arabian Peninsula, began to stir the air around the empire. At first, it was a distant murmur, something heard in the markets, something spoken of in courtyards with uncertain tones, but then it arrived as force, as armies, as fire upon the frontiers. The Byzantine emperors, once guardians of Mediterranean shores, now found themselves hemmed in by faiths not their own, by lands that once bowed to them now turning east in prayer. The empire shrank, and yet still it held its form. For Byzantium did not collapse, it recoiled, adjusted, survived. The emperors adapted, they restructured, they turned inward, strengthening the very core of the empire rather than its sprawling borders. And so the city, ever ancient and ever new, wrapped itself tighter around faith and ritual, drawing strength from what could not be conquered its spirit. The palace refined its ceremonies. Each motion of the emperor became more symbolic, more deliberate. To speak was to bless, to walk was to enact divine will. The emperor became less ruler and more icon. The people did not question it, not because they were blind, but because they needed something unchanging in a world that never stopped trembling. This age gave rise to emperors less known for conquest and more for endurance. And in their silence, others rose to prominence: generals, bishops, scribes, monks. The church began to stretch beyond its walls. entangling itself with policy and throne. Theology was not an abstract pursuit in Byzantium. It was a matter of survival. The question of icons, those painted windows into the divine, became a firestorm. Were they holy or idolatrous? Could wood and paint carry spirit? Could a face painted in devotion bring one closer to God, or drag them into sin? Iconoclasm shattered the empire's sense of self. Emperors banned images. Monks hid them. Soldiers scraped faces from frescoes while weeping grandmothers smuggled tiny portraits beneath their robes. Churches became battlegrounds not of sword, but of silence walls once adorned with Christ, and Mary now blank, pale, mournful. And through this, emperors rose and fell. Some enforced the bans with fury, others restored the images, only to see new waves of destruction rise again. It was not merely a theological war, but a crisis of identity. Byzantium was a world of vision, of beauty as prayer. Without icons, it lost its mirror, and then, as all storms eventually do, the chaos passed. Icons returned, faces reappeared on chapel walls, the Virgin's gaze once again met the believer's eyes, and the city exhaled. But something had changed. Byzantium was older now, slower, its breath deeper. The outer territories were mostly gone, swallowed by Arab caliphates, surrendered to time. But the soul of the empire was not in land. It was in the ritual of dawn prayers, in the rhythm of the liturgical year, in the gentle hum of choirs beneath the arch of Hagia Sophia. It was in how the emperor kissed relics before council, in how the people still lit oil lamps on winter evenings and sang songs older than memory. The empire had become itself no longer Rome reborn, but Byzantium. Fully and finally, it was a civilization not of expansion, but of preservation. It guarded not just land, but the light of classical thought, of ancient scripture, of sacred song. Monasteries in distant hills copied scrolls by hand, their ink freezing in cold morning air, their breath forming clouds as they whispered the names of philosophers and saints. The empire became a library built of stone, and the emperors, whether wise or weak, understood that their duty was not to conquer, but to protect not merely borders, but truth. And so the Byzantine emperors began to rule with a new kind of power, the power of memory. Their crowns gleamed not because they dazzled new lands, but because they held within them the reflection of centuries. Each successor inherited not only a throne, but a ghost, the weight of Theodosius, of Justinian, of Theodora, of countless unnamed martyrs and generals whose decisions had shaped the very bones of the empire. Byzantium endured not by resisting change, but by absorbing it, by wrapping even its losses in gold thread and weaving them into its story. And above it all, the dome of Hagia Sophia remained, hovering like a promise over the city, reminding all who walked beneath it that the divine still lived among men, that even in decline there was grace, and in stillness, strength. The city woke slowly, always slowly, as if reluctant to disturb the dream it had been weaving through the centuries. Each morning, just before the bells rang and the sun touched the golden dome of Hagia Sophia, Constantinople shimmered in that quiet moment between night and day, a breath held by the world. The fishermen along the Golden Horn hauled in their nets, dripping and glittering with silver-scaled promise, while bakers in shadowed courtyards coaxed fire into clay ovens, their fingers dusted with flour and old stories. Water sellers, wrapped in wool against the morning chill, stirred the streets with a jingle of copper flasks. This city, this empire, moved not with haste but with rhythm, a sacred cadence passed down from emperor to emperor, monk to monk, merchant to merchant. In that rhythm, the Byzantines found a sense of time that did not belong to the wider world. While kingdoms rose and fell beyond the mountains, while new languages spread across the sands, Byzantium traced its arc in incense smoke and candlelight. The emperors, now more ethereal than ever, ruled behind the layers of ceremony seen only in processions, cloaked in jeweled robes, their every gesture watched, every silence interpreted. It was not necessary that the people speak to them. It was enough to see them pass on a dais, through a curtained window, beneath a canopy carried by 10 men, and to know that the empire was still breathing. And in this golden stillness came Basil. Not one, but many Basils would take the throne. But one would shine brighter and darker than them all, Basil too. The Bulgar slayer, his name, whispered through history like a drawn blade, carried a chill. He ruled not with theatrics, not with the glitter of gold, but with the cold force of purpose, a soldier emperor, hardened by betrayal and sharpened by years of war. He cut a different figure than the robed, distant rulers who had become symbols more than men. Basil ate with his troops, slept in the dirt beside them, wore armor instead of silk. He didn't play at divinity, he let others do that for him, while he became the blade that defended what was left of the empire. When his enemies looked to Constantinople, they didn't dream of plunder or conquest. They dreamed only of how long they might survive. Basil waged war not out of cruelty, but out of necessity. The empire, encircled by threats, needed strength not in word, but in action. And he gave it, campaign after campaign. He carved back pieces of the world that had slipped away, pushing back the Bulgarians with unrelenting precision. His victories were not merely battlefield triumphs, they were warnings, carved into the minds of those who would challenge the Byzantine eagle. He broke armies, dismantled dynasties, and in one terrifying gesture, he blinded thousands of captured soldiers, sending them home in groups of 100, each led by a single man left with one eye to guide the rest. It was not glory, it was message. It was the whisper of inevitability, and still, despite his fearsome name, Basil did not revel in cruelty. He returned to Constantinople not with parades, but with silence. He gave gifts to monasteries, funded churches, expanded the treasury. When he died, he was buried not in a lavish sarcophagus, but in a humble tomb, marked with words that spoke only of duty and victory. Yet victory, no matter how complete, cannot halt the tide of time. After Basil, the empire began again to soften, not collapse, not yet, but soften. The great families, aristocrats once kept in check by emperors of iron, began to stretch their roots deeper into the soil of power. Titles became inheritance rather than reward. Gold flowed less into walls and more into weddings, alliances, and feasts. The palace remained grand, but behind its curtains, the tone changed. Some emperors still held vision, still walked with purpose, but many ruled like caretakers of a legacy they could no longer feel pulsing beneath their feet. And yet, even in this quiet unraveling, the empire shimmered, the arts flourished, icons returned to their places with greater glory than before. Poets wrote verses that dripped with longing and holy fire. Mosaics caught the light in new ways, as if time itself were refracted in their glass. Constantinople did not fall it dreamed. Still, and in its dream, it wove beauty that defied decline. Foreigners, even enemies, stood in awe before its gates. The Rus came by river, their tall frames and braided hair strange among the domes and incense. But even they fell to silence when they entered Hagia Sophia and heard the choir. Later, they would say, "We no longer knew whether we were in heaven or on earth." The power of the city was not in its armies, but in its awe. And so the emperors of this era lived not as conquerors, but as curators of memory, of ritual, of light. They presided over a fragile miracle. The city stood at the crossroads of trade, faith, and power, a jewel set between continents. Its markets teemed with spices, silks, furs, and silver. Its scholars debated the mysteries of the soul. Its priests guarded relics said to be the bones of saints, the wood of the true cross, even the robe of the Virgin. Pilgrims wept before them. Beggars slept beside their chapels. Emperors knelt in private, their lips moving in ancient prayers. Through it all, the empire breathed not steadily, but persistently. Each breath a miracle, and each breath one closer to the shadows gathering beyond the hills. But not yet. Not in this time of basilicas and lantern-lit processions. Not while the domes still gleamed and the bells still rang. Not while the emperor, however frail, still emerged each year to bless the waters and remind the people, and perhaps himself, that the divine still watched over Constantinople. It was not a golden age in the eyes of the world, but within the city, where memory hummed in every arch and echo, it was enough. Enough to believe, enough to endure. Icons returned to their niches, not just as paintings, but as presence's eyes that watched without blinking, faces that carried both tenderness and judgment, mouths that never moved, and yet whispered through candlelight and shadow. In every chapel and palace hall, the saints gazed down again from panels of gold and tempered pigment, their halos glowing faintly beneath the flicker of hanging lamps. The air itself seemed to hum with reverence. Monks crossed themselves and wept. Merchants kissed the edges of old icons as they passed, and mothers traced tiny crosses over their children's brows, whispering the names of long-dead martyrs. This was the Byzantium that rose from the silence after the iconoclasts, a city that had found its reflection once more, had remembered how to see its soul through the gaze of painted saints. In the palace, ceremonies multiplied in complexity, like layers of lace folded over time. The emperor no longer simply ruled. He performed a sacred drama with each appearance, each movement scripted by centuries of tradition, even the way he held his hand, the way he turned to accept incense from the patriarch, the very pace of his walk through the corridors of the Magnora, all of it was wrapped in ritual. The throne did not merely hold him, it transformed him. Those who looked upon him during the high feast in Hagia Sophia, flanked by choir and clergy, saw not just a man, but a symbol suspended between heaven and earth. He stood beneath a dome that echoed like a bell, under mosaics where Christ Pantocrator reigned from above, and for a moment, even the dust motes in the light seemed to pause, as if reverent. But while the city sang and the liturgy swelled, far from Constantinople's shores, the world was shifting. A storm was gathering on the plains and forests to the north and west, not sudden, but slow, deliberate, like ice forming in the bones. The Franks, the Normans, the Lombards all spoke tongues strange to Byzantine ears, yet their swords cut deep. They did not come with reverence. They came with purpose, with banners, and with suspicion. Though they called themselves Christian, their eyes were often turned to Rome, not Constantinople. And in that slow drifting apart, an old crack widened. For centuries, the Latin West and the Greek East had danced in uneasy rhythm, sharing faith, yet differing in soul. Now, mistrust bloomed where fellowship once stood. The schism of 1054 did not burst forth like war, but unfurled like a shadow stretching across a field. A cardinal placed a letter on the altar of Hagia Sophia, a letter of excommunication. The patriarch responded in kind. There were no swords drawn that day, but something deeper was broken. Brothers turned their backs to one another, and the empire, though it still glittered, stood more alone than ever. Still, the Byzantines endured. They had weathered worse, and for a time, the rituals continued uninterrupted. The empire's borders shifted, contracting here, expanding briefly there, but the city remained untouched. Safe behind its ancient walls, it breathed the rhythms of liturgy, trade, and memory. The emperors came and went, some wise, some feckless, some tragic. Dynasties rose, intertwined, crumbled. A wedding could mean peace. A rumor could spark revolt. Yet, through it all, Constantinople's pulse continued. Ships still docked in the Golden Horn, bringing spices from Arabia, fur from the steppes, honey from the Balkans. Scholars still debated theology deep into the night, their voices echoing through cloisters where oil lamps flickered. Scribes bent over parchment, copying not only the words of saints, but of Homer, Plato, Galen. The empire had become a great library of civilization, a flame carefully guarded, even as the winds of history howled beyond the gates. But even libraries can burn. The First Crusade came not as a threat, but as a request. The emperor at the time, Alexios Komnenos, had reached out not in desperation, but in strategy, asking the West for mercenaries to aid in reclaiming Anatolia from the Seljuk Turks. What came instead were waves of armored pilgrims, swelling like a tide. Frenchmen, Normans, Germans, all bearing crosses on their chests, but fire in their eyes. They passed through Constantinople, marveling at its towers, its domes, its relics. They bowed, kissed the emperor's ring, and took his gold. And then they left, marching east. Their path left behind both victory and suspicion. The Byzantines watched them go with unease, sensing in their zeal something unquiet. These were not men of the city. They were men of dust and sword. And yet, Byzantium survived the First Crusade. It even regained lands, restored pride, patched its fraying borders. For a moment, it seemed as though the old strength had returned. Alexios was followed by emperors who, though never as fierce as Basil, managed to hold the line. The Komnenian dynasty brought stability, splendor, a kind of hard-won dignity. The city again glowed in silk and stone. Poets praised the emperors. Peacocks strutted in palace gardens. Scholars spoke of renewal. But beneath the marbled floors, the ground had shifted, wealth concentrated in the hands of the few. The countryside, once vibrant, grew tired. The people whispered more often of old glories than new ones, and the West watched. Then came the Fourth Crusade. It was meant for Egypt. It was meant for Jerusalem, but it never reached them. Twisted by debt, politics, and vengeance, the Crusaders turned their eyes to Constantinople, and in 1204 the unthinkable happened. The city of Constantine, queen of cities, guardian of holy relics, sanctuary of saints, was taken by force, not by Persians, not by Arabs, but by fellow Christians. The Latins broke through the sea walls, their ships tethered to the very stones Byzantium had trusted for centuries. Fires consumed districts, statues, centuries old, were melted for coin. Churches were defiled, monasteries looted, relics, bones of apostles, pieces of the true cross were packed into crates and sent west. Even the Hagia Sophia was not spared. Its sacred floor echoed not with hymns, but with drunken laughter and the clatter of stolen gold. The emperor fled, the palace was abandoned, and for the first time in nearly 9 centuries, Constantinople, the unbreachable, had fallen. The Latin Empire was built upon its ruins, a crown forged from broken marble and stolen faith. For 57 years, Byzantium became a ghost, remembered in exile by those who clung to its name in Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus. But ghosts do not die. In 1261 the city was reclaimed, not by army, but by stealth. Michael VIII Palaiologos retook it with barely a skirmish, walking into a city quiet with trauma, heavy with smoke and absence. Constantinople was back in Byzantine hands, but it was never quite the same. Its treasures were gone, its people scattered, its soul bruised, and yet it endured, with fewer riches, with dimmer light, but it endured. When the Byzantines returned to their broken city, it didn't greet them with trumpets or shining banners, but with silence. Grass had begun to grow between the stones of once glorious courtyards. The dome still stood, but the gold that had once glinted with divine promise was dulled by soot, streaked by smoke that had never fully lifted. The mosaics, those sacred windows of color and devotion, had been pried from walls and shipped west, their absences like missing teeth in a smile that no longer knew how to form. Yet, even so, there was breath left in the old city. The men who entered it in 1261 did not arrive as conquerors but as mourners, reclaiming a corpse still warm with memory. They walked through shattered gates, past desecrated churches and roofless basilicas, and found beneath the ruins a pulse weak, but real. And so began the long, slow work of resurrection, not of glory, but of survival. Michael VIII Palaiologos, the emperor who restored the city, understood he had not reclaimed an empire, but a symbol. He would never rule as Basil had, never inspire awe like Justinian, but he would plant seeds in scorched earth and hope they would grow. The city was patched, not restored. The palace, once an intricate theater of power, was now a hollow shell. The emperors no longer lived in its echoing halls. Instead, they retreated to the Blachernae Palace, a smaller, sturdier structure near the city walls, less a palace of divine theater, more a fortress of necessity. There, behind aging stone, emperors ruled not as lords of the world, but as caretakers of a legacy they could no longer fully carry. The empire they now governed was no longer a true empire. It was a series of islands, scattered territories stitched together by old loyalties and flickering embers of faith. The West had taken much, and what remained was eyed hungrily by rising powers to the east. The Seljuks had given way to new threats sharper, more disciplined, more patient. Among them rose a small but determined power, the Ottomans. At first, they seemed like one among many. The Byzantines had seen countless tribal confederations rise and vanish like smoke in the past. But these Ottomans were different. They moved with purpose, forged alliances with cunning, and tested the old walls not with blind fury, but with careful pressure. They did not need to storm the city all at once. They would tighten the world around it, inch by inch, until there was no breath left. Within Constantinople, life continued, as it always had. Children were born beneath the sagging ceilings. Priests lit candles before altars, missing half their relics. Merchants still bartered in shadowed alleys, their scales rusted but accurate. The church still chanted, the bells still rang, and Hagia Sophia, though pillaged and dimmer than before, still stood like a mother watching her wounded child. But the grandeur was gone. What once had shimmered now rusted. What had echoed now whispered. And yet the people loved it more than ever. For the city was no longer a beacon of empire, but a sacred memory in stone. Each gate, each column, each fading fresco, they were not just structures, but prayers. The emperors knew it. Their crowns no longer gleamed. Their thrones no longer lifted them on hidden pulleys. They were men who lived in shadows, who wrote letters not of command, but of appeal to the West, to the Pope, to any who might remember that once this city had been the light of the world. But few answered. The Latin world, still remembering the spoils of 1204, saw little reason to save what they had once plundered. The Pope would offer help, but at the cost of submission, the East must bow to the Latin Church. And so, Constantinople stood between two devourers, one with swords, one with theology. The emperors, desperate, tried diplomacy. They made overtures, signed councils, sent envoys in robes too thin for winter. Sometimes they succeeded in gaining sympathy, even gold, but it was never enough. The cracks grew, the defenses thinned, the old walls, though mighty, were no longer tended with care. The armories emptied, the ships rotted in harbor, and yet, in the monasteries and the hearts of the faithful, a strange kind of hope persisted. Not the hope of victory that had passed, but the hope that the city itself, as sacred vessel, would endure beyond the end. Meanwhile, the Ottomans grew. Under rulers of ambition and vision, they expanded across Anatolia and the Balkans. They studied the city, learned its patterns, waited. They encircled it not only with armies, but with inevitability. By the mid-15th century, the empire had shrunk to the city itself and a few surrounding lands. And even within Constantinople, famine and disrepair had taken root. The city was quieter now. Fewer markets opened at dawn. Fewer candles were lit in the vast cavern of Hagia Sophia, but still it stood. And so we arrive at the last Constantine the Vitaiceth Palaiologos. His name echoed the founder, though his crown was tarnished, his robe patched. He was not a legend, but a man weary, solemn, dignified. He knew what loomed beyond the horizon. He knew the Ottoman Sultan, Mehmed II, was preparing more than just another siege. He was preparing a reckoning. And yet, Constantine didn't flee. He didn't bargain for escape. He walked the walls, inspected the gates, spoke to the people not as a god, but as a guardian. He stood in Hagia Sophia the night before the end, among clergy and soldiers and children. The final liturgy echoed beneath the great dome, its chant soft, broken, holy. All divisions dissolved that night, Greek and Latin, priest and layman, emperor and beggar. They sang with one voice because they knew the silence that would follow. And then, morning, May 29th, 1453. The cannons thundered. Mehmed's army, vast and relentless, stormed the walls. The defense, brave but thin, faltered. The gates broke. Blood ran where incense once drifted. Constantine the 14th was last seen with sword drawn, vanishing into the crowd of defenders, choosing death over surrender. The Ottomans entered the city. Some looted, some prayed, some stood in awe before what remained of the Byzantine dream. The crescent rose where the cross had stood. Hagia Sophia, spared from destruction, was transformed, not desecrated, but converted. its mosaics whitewashed, its bells silenced. The city had fallen. The empire was gone. But the breath of Byzantium did not vanish. It lingered in the domes, in the manuscripts carried west by fleeing scholars, in the chants preserved by monks in distant mountains, in the art and laws and dreams of those who came after. It whispered through the Renaissance. It shimmered in the vaulted ceilings of cathedrals built in the Latin lands. It breathed in the hearts of those who remembered not with bitterness, but with quiet awe that once, for over 1,000 years, a city by the sea had held the light of a fallen world. And though the light dimmed, it was never fully extinguished. Even after the last banner of the double-headed eagle had been torn from its mast, after the final procession had wound its way through the streets in tearful chant, the soul of Byzantium did not scatter like ash. Instead, it drifted not upward, but outward, moving quietly through monasteries, across borders, into the hearts of exiles and the minds of scholars, until it settled into the corners of Europe like a forgotten incense still clinging to old stone. The city itself had changed. It no longer answered to the rhythms of the Orthodox calendar. The bells were gone, their iron mouths silenced, and in their place rose the muezzin's call, haunting, beautiful, stretching across the domes and courtyards that once rang with the cadences of Greek hymns. Constantinople, now under a new name, had not been destroyed. It had been transformed, and in that transformation, something delicate was preserved, the very architecture of memory. Hagia Sophia, the great beating heart of the city for over 9 centuries, remained standing. The Ottomans, in their wisdom and their triumph, chose not to level it. Instead, they honored its beauty by repurposing it. The mosaics were not obliterated, but covered not out of malice, but reverence misunderstood. The Virgin still hovered in the apse, though now hidden behind layers of whitewash. The Christ Pancrator still loomed in the dome, now unseen by mortal eyes. But they were still there, beneath every brush of plaster, beneath every new coat of paint. The Byzantines remained quiet, unseen, and listening. The city no longer spoke in Greek. Its courtiers were gone, its scholars scattered, but the stones had learned the liturgy by heart, and they whispered it still, in the way light curved through arches, in the way shadows pooled around the columns at dusk. Those who fled the priests, the monks, the scribes carried more than relics. They carried the mind of Byzantium. Some made their way west, into Italy, into the courts of Florence and Venice, cities once contemptuous of the Greeks, now humbled by what they discovered. The books the exiles brought were not mere curiosities. They were treasures: Plato, Aristotle, Galen, Euclid, works preserved, copied, and cherished within Byzantine walls while the West had forgotten them. And as the Renaissance dawned, those manuscripts lit new fires. Painters studied Byzantine icons, marveling at the tension between stylized divinity and tender realism. Architects borrowed the sweeping domes and graceful arches, echoing them in cathedrals from Genoa to Prague. Even law, once etched in the cold symmetry of Justinian's code, found new life in universities from Paris to Salamanca. Byzantium, in death, became a seed. In the East, the echo was different but no less enduring. The Orthodox Church, wounded by the fall, turned to new centers, to Mount Athos, to Moscow, to the distant outposts of Slavic lands. In Russia, the idea of Byzantium found fertile ground. Ivan III, Grand Prince of Moscow, married Sophia Palaiologina, niece of the last emperor, and with that union declared Moscow the Third Rome. The first had fallen to heresy, the second had fallen to the Turks, but the third, they vowed, would not fall. The Byzantine eagle, double-headed and defiant, was sewn into Russian standards. The Orthodox rites, shaped in the shadow of Hagia Sophia, were preserved in icy cathedrals under northern skies, in candles and hymns, in the slow, solemn movements of the liturgy. Byzantium breathed still. Even the West, long dismissive of the Eastern Empire it had once scorned as decadent and obscure, began to understand its legacy. Historians, centuries later, would unroll the dusty scrolls and find there the patient, painstaking labor of a civilization that had outlasted emperors, crusades, and plagues. They would find in its art not cold gold, but warmth, a longing for heaven rendered in pigment and prayer. They would trace the curves of its letters and find voices of women like Cassia, who composed sacred music still sung, of chroniclers who recorded not only battles, but eclipses, harvests, and dreams. They would listen to those voices, at last, and hear not decline, but endurance. And within the city itself, now Istanbul, the ghosts of Byzantium walked slowly, no longer mournful, simply present, in every stone arch, in every stair that curved upward toward a forgotten cloister. They moved gently. The Grand Bazaar buzzed with voices in a dozen tongues, its floor worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, some of which had once carried imperial sandals. The waters of the Bosphorus still flowed as they had in Justinian's time, blue, restless, eternal. The sea did not care who ruled its banks, but the city remembered. It remembered in silence, sometimes in the soft hush before morning, when the air was still and the streets empty. An old wind would pass through the city. It would ruffle the laundry on distant rooftops, stir the pigeons that roosted near the domes, and carry with it the scent of something faintly liturgical, a memory, perhaps, of myrrh or wax, or the crushed petals once strewn before icons in procession. No one heard it clearly, but sometimes an old woman, kneeling beside a well, or a boy watching the gulls from a tower window, might pause and look around, as if they had heard a voice call their name in a language they did not speak. This, too, was Byzantium. It did not end in flame. It did not vanish in a single moment. It dissolved like sugar in wine, slowly, thoroughly, sweetly. It mingled with what came after, altering it, deepening it, leaving behind something more mysterious than survival presence. It became not a nation, not a church, not a history, but a perfume of thought, a style of dreaming that fused earth and heaven, that draped reason in gold and wrapped devotion in argument. It believed that beauty was a form of truth, and that silence, the long, arching silence beneath a dome, could speak more clearly than thunder. And so, if you ever walk the old streets of the city, if you find yourself near the cisterns, or the crumbling outer walls where grass now grows between the stones, listen, not for words, not for hymns, but for the weight of time pressing gently against your chest. That is Byzantium. It does not call. It does not explain. It simply is waiting, beneath the dust, beneath the marble, beneath even memory. It waits not for restoration, but for reverence, for someone, somewhere, to pause and see the world not as surface, but as depth, to look past the crack in a mosaic and find within it an entire sky. For over 1,000 years, the emperors ruled not only with laws and armies, but with symbols, with silence, with dreams. And even now, when those emperors are only names carved into old stones, their dream continues, not as empire, not as church, but as a light faint, flickering, but never extinguished in the long corridor of human history. From the rooftops of modern Istanbul, if one looks carefully, the outline of ancient Constantinople still breathes beneath the present. It is faint, like a fresco beneath newer paint, just visible if the light strikes at the right angle, just audible if one listens between the sounds of taxis and market calls. The shape of the land remembers 7 hills, like a sacred pattern pressed into the earth, and between them, narrow streets twist as they always have, bending not out of design, but out of memory alleys that once carried processions of emperors, now echoing with the laughter of children and the murmur of shopkeepers. Beneath the stone arches, the scent of roasted chestnuts mixes with a distant sea breeze, and in the corners of half-crumbled buildings, plants grow stubborn, wild, beautiful. The city has always been like this. It wears its past not proudly, but quietly, like an old man who no longer speaks of the wars he survived. And yet, beneath the silence, the marble still holds breath. The ruins do not shout. They hum. They remember, down in the ancient cisterns, where columns rise from dark waters like trees in a drowned forest. One can still sense the weight of time pressing downward. Moss crawls slowly over capitals carved by unseen hands a millennium ago. Water drips in slow rhythms, tapping out syllables of forgotten names. Tourists whisper now in places where once only priests and slaves moved, carrying buckets or prayers. Depending on the hour, the Medusa heads still sit at the base of the columns, silent and submerged, their gaze turned sideways, as though they, too, are tired of watching. In these places, Byzantium is not dead, it is dreaming. Not a dream that fades, but one that deepens, one that grows thicker with each passing century. Its beauty is no longer blinding, it is the kind that must be sat with, patiently, quietly, like a candle in a cavern. Above ground, many walk without noticing. They pass the column of Constantine, now worn and cracked, perhaps not realizing that once it stood gilded with bronze, crowned with a statue of the emperor himself, dressed not in Roman armor, but in the robes of Apollo. The merging of gods and rulers, that peculiar Byzantine art of layering meanings, is no longer visible to the casual eye, but the base remains. If one rests their hand on its warm surface in the afternoon sun, they may feel the pulse of old ceremony beating softly beneath the stone. Nearby, fragments of aqueducts stretch between buildings like the arms of forgotten giants. Pigeons roost there now, and vendors beneath sell tea in small tulip-shaped glasses. Life continues. But even as it does, it flows around the bones of the old empire, like water around stone, always adjusting, but never erasing. The people of the city, generations removed from the emperors, the monks, the mosaic workers, do not need to speak Greek to feel the city's past. It is in the way they look up at the domes, in the way they pause before entering a church-turned mosque, in the way the call to prayer echoes with a reverence that seems to transcend any single faith. For here, in this city, prayer is not just sound, it is structure. It is the curve of every arch, the sweep of every step. Even those who do not believe find themselves speaking more softly here. There is a hush that the city teaches, not imposed, but inherited. It is the hush of those who know they walk upon layers of lives, stacked like pages of an ancient book, each worn by time and thumbed by memory. And sometimes, if the day is warm and the breeze carries in from the sea, an old man might sit beneath a fig tree outside a crumbling church and tell stories to no one in particular. Stories of emperors who vanished in battle, of monks who spoke with angels, of ships made entirely of gold that once sailed down the Bosphorus before dawn. None of it can be verified. All of it might be true. In Byzantium, truth was never about fact alone. It was about what endured. And these stories, passed from tongue to tongue like prayer beads, endure not because they are provable, but because they are beautiful. This was always the Byzantine gift, not only to build and govern, but to weave time into poetry. Their laws survived in the West, but their hearts survived in the East, and in the places where East and West still meet, not in conflict, but in conversation. The empire did not fall in one moment. It faded, receded, folded itself like cloth, and then it entered the imagination of the world. Like Troy, like Atlantis, but unlike those, Byzantium left behind more than myth. It left manuscripts, walls, icons, melodies that still rise in Orthodox liturgies. It left a way of seeing, a way of believing that the divine could be mirrored in gold and geometry, that power could be wrapped in silence, that the line between heaven and earth was thin and glimmering. Even now, in lands far from the Bosphorus, Byzantium whispers. In the architecture of churches with onion domes and candlelit interiors, in the chant of choirs singing in minor keys, their tones rising like incense into domes painted with watchful saints, in the philosophies that trace ethics not through rule, but through beauty, in the ways people still kiss icons, light candles, and cross themselves before entering holy space, not out of fear, but out of love for a mystery they cannot name. And perhaps that is what the empire truly was, not a kingdom of borders and taxes and treaties, but a kingdom of mystery, a place where things unseen were given form, where the invisible was made visible through ritual, art, and quiet devotion, a place that taught its people to look deeper into shadows, into silence, into the curve of a mosaic's eye. It was never simple. It was never clean. It was full of contradiction, of cruelty and compassion, of power and prayer, of splendor built upon suffering. but it was whole. Whole in the way only something deeply human can be. Now, with centuries between us and their time, we are perhaps better able to see them not as failed Romans, not as a footnote between antiquity and the Renaissance, but as something singular, something luminous, an empire that lived not only in stone, but in rhythm, in breath, in light. So when the sun sets over Istanbul, and the call to prayer echoes from the minarets, some of which were once bell towers, and the shadows grow long across the hills, imagine the sound that is not heard, the quiet toll of a bell that no longer rings, but once called a city to its knees in reverence. Imagine the rustle of robes along marble floors, the soft click of a censer, the scent of myrrh in cold air. Imagine a world not lost, but waiting beneath the skin of the city, beneath the steps of the passerby, beneath the hush of dusk. That is Byzantium. Still here, still listening. There are cities that shout, that declare their might with every tower, every monument, every rush of traffic and ambition, but Constantinople, the eternal, sorrowed, half-sleeping soul of Byzantium has never shouted. Even at its height, it murmured. Its glory was not thunder, but the rustle of robes through shadowed corridors, the soft clink of censers, the shimmering hush of mosaics that seemed to breathe as light moved across their glassy fragments. It was a city of veils, of layers, of half-seen truths. Its power did not lie only in what could be measured not merely in armies or taxes or laws, but in the rituals that bound the hours, the unseen hands that lit lamps at dusk, the slow rhythm of centuries turning like prayer beads through fingers of stone. And even now, in the modern sprawl of Istanbul, where skyscrapers have risen and trams hum along ancient routes, there are corners where time doesn't pass as it should. A narrow stairwell behind a crumbling wall, a forgotten chapel beneath a bank, a stretch of aqueduct arching overhead like the ribcage of a sleeping titan. In these places, one can almost hear it again, the chant, the silence, the heartbeat of a city that once believed itself eternal. It wasn't just the architecture, though the city's bones told stories few can now read. It was in the air. The Byzantines believed that divine order was written into every stone, that heaven was not a place far above, but a pattern that could be mirrored on earth in icons, in domes, in music. Their architects did not merely build to shelter bodies, but to shape the soul. When a visitor stepped into Hagia Sophia, they entered not a building but an atmosphere. The acoustics, tuned by geometry and grace, carried chants like fog soft, curling, slow. The dome did not press down but lifted upward, as if inviting the gaze, and with it the heart, to rise. Light filtered in not as brilliance but as gold-dusted breath, settling on mosaics that stared out with eyes unmoved by time, and all around, the presence of the unseen that was Byzantium's gift, to make the invisible feel close, to render mystery not as confusion, but as intimacy. That mystery touched everything. Even the emperor, the most visible man in the empire, was a kind of mystery. He was not merely a sovereign, not just a commander or judge. He was a ritual in motion, a pageant made flesh. When he appeared, clad in purple dyed from rare Murx shells and crusted in pearls, it was not a man the people saw, but a moment of eternity breaking into the world. His silence was meaningful, his gestures rehearsed. The doors through which he passed were opened not merely to grant him access, but to symbolize the parting of veils between the worldly and the divine. His throne, sometimes said to rise by a mechanical device, seemed less furniture and more apparition. In this way, Byzantium ruled not only with power, but with illusion carefully crafted into devotion, not deception, but revelation made slow. Even their enemies could not help but be awed. Crusaders, traitors, travelers, even those who despised the empire's theology or envied its wealth, spoke with a reluctant wonder of the city, of the libraries that held texts lost elsewhere in the West, of the silver-lined streets on festival days, of the relics fragments of the true cross, the nails of the crucifixion, the robe of Christ carried through the streets beneath embroidered canopies, as incense mingled with rosewater and the faithful wept. They spoke of the people who moved with a grace born not of pride but of memory, as if each citizen carried in their body the history of 10 generations, each step echoing with the pace of something older than themselves. And yet, Byzantium was never merely dream. It was also iron and dust and bone. Its monasteries were not only sanctuaries of learning, but battlegrounds of politics. Its courts swirled with intrigues so delicate and deadly that one wrong glance might mean exile or worse. Eunuchs with no families wielded dynastic power. Generals wrote letters in cipher. Empresses plotted with bishops. And through it all, the empire endured not by perfection, but by adaptability. It bent, absorbed, transformed. It took the blows of Persians, Arabs, Bulgarians, Crusaders, and still it rose, not unchanged, but not undone. Each scar became ornament. Each loss became a line in the hymn. Even its language was a monument. Greek, yes, but Greek reshaped, softened, sung. The speech of Byzantium was not the clipped rhetoric of Plato, but a living tongue braided with liturgy, legalism, and love. In its syllables echoed the Psalms and the laws of Justinian, the love letters of saints and the manifestos of emperors. The scribes who copied text by lamplight were not simply preserving words, but holding back the dark. They knew that one torn scroll might mean the silence of a century, and so they worked, slowly, reverently, illuminating each letter with the tenderness of prayer. The city itself was a manuscript written in stone. Its walls, especially those triple Theodosian walls, stood like a sentence no invader could finish. For 1,000 years, they held, through siege and famine, through fire and betrayal. They held. Generations of soldiers stood atop them, watching dust rise on distant roads, wondering if the army approaching would mean death or diplomacy. Children grew up within their shadow, knowing their outline better than the constellations. And even now, broken in places, overgrown in others, those walls still stand part ruin, part monument, part promise. They are not beautiful in the way that domes are beautiful, but they are the city's memory of strength. They are the ribs that once protected its heart. In the end, the empire did not collapse in arrogance, nor vanish in a single blaze. It faded the way old songs fade, still lovely, still echoing in quiet corners, but no longer sung in the streets. And yet, there are places where the song begins again. A choir in a monastery in Greece, a procession in Serbia, an icon on a wall in Georgia, a phrase in Russian that traces its roots to the Patriarchate of Constantinople, a legal code in Italy that still bears the stamp of Justinian. The empire is not gone. It is diffused. Its spirit has scattered like pollen unseen, but potent, blooming wherever memory finds soil. That is what makes Byzantium unique. Not just its survival, though it outlived the western half of Rome by nearly 1,000 years, but its manner of living. It did not roar. It resonated. It did not conquer the world. It cultivated a garden of thought, devotion, and form that grew inward and upward, seeking not always expansion, but understanding. And in that, it gave something rare to history, not only what was done, but how it was felt. The feeling of a morning lit by golden light on mosaic, the smell of beeswax and incense, the quiet murmur of prayer rolling down a marble nave. To be Byzantine was to live in the tension between earth and heaven, flesh and icon, empire and faith, and to walk through what remains to lay your hand on a cracked column. To trace the edge of a forgotten fresco is to enter that tension, to feel it, still pulsing, not dead, only waiting. At twilight, when the streets begin to empty and the light softens to a pale amber that stains the stones gold, the echoes grow louder, not the echoes of traffic or voices, but something deeper, the hush of layered centuries, rising slowly like incense through the cracks of the city. It is in these hours that the ghosts of Byzantium seem to return most vividly. Though they wear no chains, no cloaks, they do not haunt in sorrow. They simply drift among the arches of the ancient forums, across the steps of old chapels turned warehouses, over the dust that settles on forgotten thresholds. A city doesn't die in conquest alone. It dies in forgetting. But Constantinople reborn, renamed, repurposed, has never been forgotten. Its story was too long, too luminous, too layered to be dismissed, and so it remains, not alive in the way it once was, but not dead either, something in between, like a candle still warm after its flame has gone. The streets that curve around the hippodrome still remember the thundering wheels of chariots, the cries of crowds split into factions, blue and green cheering not just for sport, but for identity, for power, for the pulse of empire. Once, those factions had nearly brought down a throne. The Nika riots of 532, born in a chariot race, raised by political discontent, ignited by centuries of division, had threatened to burn the city to ash. Justinian, still young in his reign, had stood on the precipice of flight, his ships prepared. But Theodora had spoken. One sentence, cold and resolute. Royal purple is the noblest shroud. And the emperor stayed, and the city burned. And when the fires died down and the corpses were cleared, Justinian rebuilt not just the walls, but the soul. It was after the riots that Hagia Sophia rose from the rubble, like a phoenix carved in stone and grace. And though most visitors today walk through its doors marveling at its scale, at the symmetry of its dome, few feel the fire beneath their feet. Few remember that it stands on ashes, on rebellion, on decision. That is Byzantium beauty, not in spite of suffering, but shaped by it, not fragile, but forged. As the centuries rolled on, so did the names. Emperors came and went. Some were warriors, others monks. Some ruled for decades, others for months. There were emperors crowned as children, emperors blinded by brothers, emperors who spent more time in prayer than in council chambers. And yet, the empire endured not because of the strength of its leaders, but because of the tenacity of its people, the fidelity of its rituals, the depth of its memory. The heart of Byzantium beat not only in the palace, but in the kitchens, the courtyards, the chapels lit only by a single flickering lamp. A woman grinding grain in the shadow of a monastery arch was as much the empire as the emperor himself. A monk copying the Psalms by candlelight, humming to himself in a language that was already beginning to fade, was Byzantium made flesh. And in that quiet, ordinary rhythm, the empire held. Beyond the city, the provinces danced their own dances, sometimes loyal, sometimes rebellious, always bound by trade, by liturgy, by law. The Byzantine world was not a monolith, but a mosaic of languages, climates, faces, Armenians, Syrians, Greeks, Slavs, Arabs all found space within the empire's shifting borders. It was not always peaceful. It was often tense, but Byzantium never demanded sameness. It asked only for allegiance, for taxes, and in return it offered structure, rhythm, meaning. It built roads and hospitals, hosted debates and councils, raised towers and icons alike. It gave the gift of time held in place, and that, in the ancient world, was no small thing. In the monasteries, the chant continued. Even as the borders receded, even as civil wars tore through provinces and pretenders rose like waves in the dark, the chant remained, sung by tired men with ink-stained fingers, sung by women weaving vestments, sung by children in echoing halls who didn't yet know the empire was crumbling around them. In that chant, Byzantium lived. The words changed little. The melodies shifted gently over time, like a tree bending with age. But the essence, the longing, the devotion, the reaching toward a light that shimmered just beyond the dome stayed. Music in Byzantium was never just sound. It was space. It turned walls into lungs, domes into ears, silence into language. And what of the mosaics? What of those trembling faces set in glass and stone? Their eyes too wide, too knowing, they, too, speak still. Even those that have crumbled, even those that lie hidden beneath layers of paint. Their beauty was never only in their shimmer, but in their endurance, made not for admiration, but for communion. They watched empires rise and fall. They watched prayers change languages. They watched footsteps fade, but they didn't blink. A mosaic in a ruined church is not a relic. It is a memory still speaking, and those who pass beneath their gaze, knowingly or not, inherit something, a shard of meaning, a whisper of what once was sacred. The Byzantines did not fear the end. Not exactly. They feared forgetting, and so they built with words, with songs, with pigments that held gold and lapis and ash. They carved their names into marble, not for pride, but for continuity. To say I was here, I lit the lamp, I passed it on. That is why the fall in 1453 did not sever the thread. It frayed it, yes, but the line held. In exile, in translation, in adaptation, the Byzantine soul carried forward. Today, in the distant hush of libraries, their manuscripts still rest opened carefully by scholars who breathe on them before turning each page. In remote hills, monks still chant their words. In classrooms, their stories are told again, not as footnotes but as foundations. And in Istanbul, children still play beside walls their ancestors once defended with arrows and boiling oil. They don't always know the names, but the stones know, and the city breathes them in. When the last light fades behind the domes, when the wind comes in off the Bosphorus and brushes the minarets and ruins alike, Byzantium stirs not to rise, but to remain, not to rule, but to remind. That time is not a river rushing toward the future, but a sea in which we all drift, buoyed by memory, shaped by what we choose to carry. The Byzantines chose beauty, chose ritual, chose meaning layered upon meaning, like the paint upon their icons, the verses in their chants, the steps of their solemn processions. So we remember, and remembering, we do not mourn. We listen, we walk slowly, we look upward. The footsteps of Byzantium were always quiet, even when they passed through marble halls. They did not stamp with the certainty of conquerors, nor echo with the rhythm of armies marching west. They glided, measured, deliberate like monks moving through cloisters, like the turning of pages in a sacred book, like the slow unfolding of dawn over domes that had seen 1,000 such mornings. Byzantium's greatness was never loud. It resided in subtleties, in how the smoke from a censer drifted like a veil through a chapel, in how an emperor's procession moved not in haste, but in the choreography of reverence, in how time itself seemed to bend inside the walls of the city. This was a place where the calendar was not a tool of governance alone, but a sacred cycle, a wheel that turned through fasting and feasting, through mourning and resurrection. The people of Constantinople didn't merely live through time, they lived in it, as if time itself were a sanctuary whose walls were made of chant and memory. And within those walls, history wove its threads, sometimes golden, sometimes frayed. The emperors had changed, no longer divine in the eyes of all. They were increasingly bound by debt, by diplomacy, by the shifting tides of foreign empires and internal unrest. Their robes, though still sewn with pearls and gold thread, no longer gleamed with the certainty of God's favor. Their palaces, once alive with pageantry, began to echo with emptiness. The chambers that had once hosted councils, coronations, and secret plots now bore the silence of a people retreating into survival. But in this retreat, something beautiful persisted. The rituals remained. The liturgies continued. Even as wealth vanished, the soul of Byzantium deepened, became more distilled. In monasteries high in the mountains or clinging to seaside cliffs, the quiet work of preservation endured. Scrolls were copied, icons were hidden and venerated, prayers were sung not for victory, but for endurance, not that the empire might conquer, but that it might remain. One might think this shrinking was a failure, but Byzantium was not built on expansion alone. It was built on transformation, the ability to take what was lost and turn it into wisdom. Even as the empire's map dwindled, its inner world expanded. It became introspective, poetic, saturated with theology and thought. The last centuries of the empire, though marked by loss, gave birth to profound beauty. Poets like Romanos the melodist had long passed, but their spirit lingered. New hymns emerged, rich with sorrow and radiance. The icons of this period grew more expressive, more human, less rigid, more tender. Christ's eyes looked tired. The Virgin's face bore the weight of centuries. Saints stood not as triumphant martyrs, but as companions in suffering. The art no longer aimed at impressing the world. It aimed at comforting the soul. Meanwhile, the city became a place of mirrors. In the crumbling archways, People saw the reflections of their ancestors. In the chip mosaics, they saw not only saints, but themselves fragile, luminous, temporary. The citizens of the late empire knew they lived at the end of a story. They walked through streets where emperors had once ridden on white horses and felt the stillness that follows thunder, and yet they did not despair. Instead, they lived with a kind of sacred melancholy, the awareness that they were part of something vast, fading, and beloved. This awareness gave their daily lives a quiet nobility. To buy bread, to light a lamp, to bow before an icon, these were not small acts. They were rituals of remembrance. And the city, though weary, responded. Even its stones seemed to sigh with the breath of memory. At the same time, new powers rose beyond the empire's weakened edges, the Ottomans, patient and relentless. Expanded like a tide, they did not rush, they encircled. Their leaders were not wild raiders, but careful architects of conquest, watching Constantinople not as a prize to be looted, but as a city to be claimed, inherited. They understood its symbolism, its wealth of meaning, and they approached it not only with cannons, but with a vision of their own empire, one that would rise upon Byzantine foundations. And within the city, the Byzantines knew this. They sensed the closing of a chapter. The final emperors walked the streets with sorrow in their eyes, knowing the weight they bore was not only political, but mythic. Constantine Thufin's, last of his line, carried a name that echoed the founder of the city. He understood the circle was closing, and yet, even in this twilight, the people did not abandon reverence. On the eve of the city's fall, Hagia Sophia was filled once more. The faithful gathered beneath the dome, their voices rising in ancient chant, their hands trembling with fear and devotion. It was not only a service, it was a farewell. Latin and Greek stood side by side, differences momentarily forgotten. In that final liturgy, there were no factions, only Byzantines. The priests moved through the nave, sensing the faithful, their robes brushing marble worn smooth by centuries. Outside, the enemy prepared, but inside, the city remembered who it was, and in that remembrance, it was whole. The next day, history shifted. The city was taken, the empire fell, but the spirit, that ineffable presence that had hovered over Byzantium for more than 1,000 years, did not vanish. It changed form. It moved through the hands of refugees carrying icons across the sea. It passed into the breath of monks chanting in caves and cloisters. It whispered through the corridors of Russian cathedrals, where the liturgy still carried echoes of the great church. It drifted westward, into the Renaissance, hidden in the manuscripts that Byzantine scholars brought to Italian shores. And in the east, it lingered in stone, in silence, in the curve of a dome, in the flutter of a candle's flame. Byzantium became a presence, not a place, not a power, a presence subtle, enduring, patient. It no longer governed, but it guided. Its thought shaped theologians, its art shaped painters, its music shaped the silence between notes. Its loss became a lesson, not in defeat, but in devotion. For here was a civilization that outlasted armies not by might, but by meaning. That endured not through conquest, but through contemplation. That believed not in the urgency of the moment, but in the slow unfolding of eternity. And so today, when one enters an Orthodox church, or studies a mosaic, or listens to a hymn that rises and falls like breath, one touches Byzantium, not the empire, but the essence, the rhythm, the silence after the chant ends and before the incense fades. That is where Byzantium lives, in the pause, in the reverence, in the refusal to let beauty be forgotten. It was never about grandeur alone. It was about presence, about being rooted in time, not racing through it, about seeing the world not as chaos, but as cosmos ordered, sacred, shimmering with the divine. Byzantium did not die. It entered the bloodstream of history, quiet and persistent. And now, in the glow of candlelight, in the hush before dawn, if you are very still, you might feel it. You might hear the echo of a liturgy sung in a language you do not know, and yet somehow remember. You might look up at a dome and see not stone, but sky, and you will know Byzantium breathes. When the sun slips low over the waters of the Bosphorus, casting long shadows that stretch like soft fingers across the weathered stones of the old city, it becomes easy to forget the noise of the present. The horns, the voices, the distant roar of engines all fall away for a moment, muffled by the hush of evening. And in that hush, the outlines of the ancient world stir, not in full form, not in clear detail, but in glimmers, like reflections rippling on water. There, in the worn curve of a stair that once bore the weight of a patriarch's procession, there, in the moss growing over the lintel of a gate, where guards once bowed to emperors, there, in the birds that wheel above the ruined towers of Blackernay, their wings casting fleeting shadows on the stones below, shadows that resemble, just for a second, the banners that once fluttered proudly in the wind. These traces are not accidents. They are remnants of a city that never truly left. Constantinople remains, not merely in stone, but in the way the air moves, in the way the city folds itself at twilight, in the way the past continues to lean gently against the present. Walk long enough through these streets, and you will find them layered like pages of a palimpsest, the Ottoman arches rising over Byzantine foundations, Latin inscriptions tucked beneath Greek lintels, Roman columns repurposed into mosques and fountains. The city does not reject its past, it absorbs it, and in that absorption, something rare occurs. Time becomes fluid. It is possible, here, to stand in one place and feel 1,000 years pressed softly against your skin, not with weight, but with warmth, as if the city itself remembers you, even if you have never been here before. This is the secret of Byzantium. It was never simply a place. It was and is a condition of the soul, a way of being in the world that sees depth where others see surface, that hears echoes where others hear silence, that feels history not as dead weight, but as breath still rising. And, oh, how much breath it carried. Across the centuries, the Byzantines inhaled the world and exhaled a kind of sacred clarity. They built churches not just to shelter worship, but to shape its spaces where sound could swell and circle, where light could descend in golden beams, where the eye would be drawn upward, always upward. They wrote laws not just to control, but to preserve order as a reflection of divine harmony. They painted saints not to resemble men, but to reveal the mystery beneath the flesh. Even their daily gestures bore a sense of sacrament, a meal eaten in the shadow of a monastery, a coin placed quietly into the palm of a beggar, a kiss on the cheek of a friend before the liturgy began. These were not mere customs. They were theology embodied, not proclaimed, but lived. The Byzantines did not aim for simplicity. Their world was layered, paradoxical, shimmering with contradiction. They embraced mystery. They debated the nature of Christ with fierce precision, splitting syllables like scholars splitting atoms, yet still weeping at the beauty of a hymn. They clashed over icons and yet filled their cities with color and light. They fought over doctrine, over titles, over the procession of the Holy Spirit, and then bowed in silence before the same altar. They crowned emperors with sacred oil, then exiled them days later. They were human, terribly, wonderfully human, and in that humanness, they left behind not perfection, but something far more valuable, a testament to striving, to holding the tension between heaven and earth, between faith and failure, between light and shadow, and what shadows they bore. The fall of the Western Empire had left them surrounded by uncertainty, wave after wave of invaders, shifting borders, faiths in conflict, languages multiplying at their doorstep, and yet, amidst the chaos, Constantinople stood, not untouched. No city can remain untouched, but unbroken in spirit. Its mosaics cracked, its palaces burned, its emperors changed, but the chant continued. The candles were still lit. The faithful still lined the nave at dawn, their breaths clouding the winter air, their hands crossing their bodies in the rhythm of centuries. It's easy to see Byzantium only as the empire, the politics, the wars, the maps with shifting colors, but that is not where its true soul resides. It resides in the faces of the saints that still peer from ancient walls, in the handwritten prayers tucked into the cracks of icons, in the incense that curls up toward ceilings too high to touch. It resides in what was preserved and in how it was preserved. For when the city finally fell, it did not vanish. It scattered, like sparks from a dying fire, its embers caught elsewhere, in Russia, in Greece, in the libraries of Venice, in the shadows of Orthodox monasteries perched on cliffs. Byzantium became an idea not just of what was, but of what could be, a bridge between past and future, a memory held with tenderness. It survived not by force, but by love. The love of scribes who copied texts even as their cities crumbled, the love of singers who passed down melodies with no notation, the love of mothers who taught their children to cross themselves in the old way, even when the church's bells no longer rang. And now, centuries later, that love still lingers. In the quiet chapels of Mount Athos, candles still flicker before icons painted in the style of Byzantium. In the narrow lanes of Thessaloniki, the sound of bells still rings over Byzantine walls. In the whispered syllables of ancient Greek liturgy, chanted softly in darkened churches, the voice of the empire still speaks. It does not call for power. It does not demand recognition. It simply remains. And in remaining, it teaches. It teaches that glory fades, but meaning endures. That beauty, when woven into faith, becomes a kind of defiance against decay. That silence can be more eloquent than proclamation. That the soul of a people can survive the fall of walls, the burning of libraries, the passage of centuries. Byzantium teaches patience, reverence, the art of bearing light, even in darkness. And now, when we walk through cities touched by its hand, Ravenna, Maestras, Kiev, Istanbul, we walk not through ruins, but through reminders. That time is not a straight road, but a spiral. That what once was holy can still be. That the past is not behind us, but around us, like a breath not yet exhaled. To see Byzantium clearly is to slow down, to notice the way gold leaf catches a dim beam of light, to hear the softness of a liturgical melody rising in layers, echoing across 1,000 years, to feel the curve of an arch and know that hands long gone shaped it for the sake of eternity. It is to live not in nostalgia, but in wonder, and wonder, perhaps, is Byzantium's most enduring gift. There is something about gold leaf that refuses to die. Even when chipped, darkened, or covered in soot, it clings to the surface beneath, holding light with a stubbornness that defies the centuries. In the chapels of old Byzantium, whether still standing, forgotten in rural hills, or repurposed into other faiths, this gold still glows. It does not dazzle. It does not shout. It whispers. It holds the memory of fingers that pressed it into plaster with reverence, of hands that trembled slightly as they traced the curve of a halo or the fold of a saint's robe. Every speck of it is a testament not to wealth, but to belief, the belief that beauty was a form of devotion, that to depict the holy was not merely to record it, but to participate in it. This was the Byzantine world, a world in which the sacred was not a remote abstraction, but a presence made visible, palpable, near, and as the empire aged, as its borders shrank, its treasures thinned, and its palaces dimmed, this devotion to beauty only deepened. It was not indulgence, it was remembrance, a way of saying, we are still here. The world may change, but we still see the divine in gold and shadow, in chant and silence. There is, in this, a kind of humility often missed by those who write of Byzantium from afar. They speak of decadence, of decline, of emperors obsessed with ceremony while the walls cracked behind them. But this is not the truth the city tells. Byzantium did not confuse ritual with power. It understood that ritual was endurance, that in the repetition of sacred gestures, in the turning of liturgical wheels, in the quiet lighting of lamps night after night, something was being preserved that no sword could secure. Power passes, fortresses fall, but the rhythm of prayer, if held close enough, moves through time like a steady tide. This was the strength of the empire in its final centuries, not in expansion, but in persistence, in the way its people clung to their sacred patterns, not with arrogance, but with love. This love was not loud. It did not call attention to itself. It was in the way a grandmother traced the sign of the cross over her bread before cutting it, in the way monks wove hymns from silence, not for kings, but for the night itself, In the way, a priest swept the dust from a mosaic floor before the liturgy began, knowing full well that half the image was already gone. It was a love shaped by loss, but not diminished by it. If anything, it grew more tender with each century. The more the empire was chipped away by invaders, by betrayal, by time itself, the more fiercely this quiet devotion shone. And so, paradoxically, Byzantium's smallest acts became its greatest monuments, not the domes, not the walls, but the gestures too soft to measure a whispered prayer, a flame lit in the dark, a song sung by a single voice in an empty nave. These were the acts that held the city together long after its armies had scattered. Even the emperors, in their last generations, seemed to understand this. They ruled not with the confidence of conquerors, but with the gentleness of stewards. They knew they stood at the end of something vast, not merely a state, but a world. They looked backward more often than forward, not in regret, but in gratitude. They walked beneath faded frescoes and did not see failure. They saw lineage, continuity, a thread that had survived the rise and fall of kings, the schisms of faith, the tremors of ambition. That thread, they knew, could not be tightened again, but it could still be held. And so they held it carefully, reverently, as one holds the hand of a loved one who is very old and very tired, but still breathing. Outside the walls, the world grew louder. Empires rose that measured greatness in steel and fire, in the rumble of artillery, in the weight of coins and crowns. They looked at Byzantium and saw only what had been lost. But the Byzantines themselves, those last generations of priests, scribes, craftsmen, weavers, didn't see loss. They saw distillation. They knew that what remained, though small, was pure. Their churches were fewer, but their icons more luminous. Their processions were shorter, but their hymns deeper. Their books were more precious than gold, not because of what they contained, but because of how they had been carried, hand to hand, across fire and flood, always sung, always remembered. In a mountain monastery, a scribe might spend his entire life copying a single gospel, shaping each letter with care, as if each stroke of ink were a prayer. In a seaside village, a widow might light a candle before a cracked icon and whisper a name into the silence, knowing it would be heard. These acts unnoticed, unrecorded were Byzantium, not the armies, not the treaties, not even the palaces, but the heart that kept beating, softly, even when no one was listening. And that heart, in truth, never stopped. When Constantinople finally fell, it was not the end of the empire. It was the beginning of its afterlife. Like a star collapsing into a dense and glowing ember, Byzantium's fall condensed its light. That light traveled outward into Orthodox lands, into the libraries of Europe, into the cathedrals of the Renaissance. It touched music, law, iconography, architecture, philosophy. It did not boast. It simply remained, a tone in the background of history, a silence that sings. Today, if you walk into a quiet church somewhere in the hills of Romania, or the forests of Georgia, or the white stone towns of Crete, you might find yourself surrounded by that silence. You might see a candle flickering before a face so ancient and still it seems to breathe. You might hear a chant, slow and low, rising not for show, but for love. And you will have found Byzantium not as a ruin, but as a rhythm, as a presence, as the sense, however faint, that something sacred once passed through this place and left its breath behind. Not everything needs to be restored to be remembered. Not every light must burn brightly to be seen. Byzantium knew this. It taught it. And in doing so, it gave the world not just a history, but a way of seeing, a way of holding time, and loss, and beauty, all at once, with open hands. That is why the empire still matters, not because of what it conquered, but because of what it kept. There are cities remembered for their empires, their victories, their noise, and then there are cities remembered for their silence, not the silence of desolation, but of depth. Constantinople was that second kind, a city not made of roar, but of resonance. Its stones did not forget. Its walls, even in crumbling, continued to murmur. And as centuries passed after the final fall, that murmur did not die. It deepened. It became something else, not a call to return, but a presence that lingered wherever stillness allowed it room. In the Eastern liturgies sung far from the Bosphorus, in the golden glow of icons behind candle smoke, in the intricate, measured strokes of Greek script copied in monastic cells, hidden in forests and mountains there, Byzantium breathed, not out of nostalgia, but because the rhythm it carried was never tied to territory. It was carried in the body, in the gestures passed from elder to novice, from mother to daughter, from one bowed head to the next. Byzantium was not merely a place. It was a gesture crossing oneself from right to left, pausing before bread, bowing before mystery. That gesture carried forward. In Russia, in Serbia, in the highlands of Ethiopia, even in the back rooms of Western libraries where Byzantine texts were slowly, reverently translated. Wherever someone sang a hymn older than memory, or wrote an illuminated capital letter with trembling reverence, Byzantium was present. Its influence was not linear. It didn't pass from empire to empire like a crown. It moved like a scent through fabric, through time, through breath. It lingered in the folds of the world, invisible but unmistakable to those who had once knelt beneath a dome and felt the light fall not on them, but through them. That light, golden, diffused, silent, was Byzantium's gift, not the light of conquest, but of contemplation. And contemplation had always been its core, even in its earliest days, even when the empire still wore Roman armor and spoke Latin laws. There had been a different texture to its soul. The East, though heir to the West, was never simply an extension. It was a transfiguration. It took the stones of Rome and arranged them into something softer, something that sang. Its legal codes were mirrors of Roman structure, but its theology pulsed with mystery, with paradox. Where the West sought clarity, the East lingered in silence. Where the West codified, the East painted. Byzantium was not an empire of certainty. It was an empire of wonder, and perhaps that is why it endures so vividly in the imagination. Long after its armies disbanded, its navy sank, its palaces were repurposed or ruined. It gave the world not only relics, but reflection. It taught that civilization was not only measured in roads and victories, but in how we carried the sacred into the everyday, how we shaped space to invite prayer, how we moved through time with reverence. In this, the smallest monastery and the grandest cathedral were the same. Both were places where heaven was invited to touch earth, not with spectacle, but with gentleness. Inside Hagia Sophia, when it was still a church, time behaved differently. The dome floated, not pressed down. The light came in not to illuminate, but to soothe. The chants did not echo as much as they wove themselves into the very air. A visitor might stand in the center and feel the hum of centuries rising from the floor, as though the marble itself remembered the footsteps of those who had come before emperors, bishops, beggars. All had stood there. All had looked up. All had felt themselves small, not in shame, but in awe. That experience, more than the doctrines debated in council or the borders drawn on parchment, was Byzantium. And even after the dome ceased to host Christian liturgies, even when its icons were covered, even when the language changed and the name of the city was spoken differently, the shape of that reverence remained. The space held the memory, because reverence, once poured into stone and gesture, does not fade quickly. It stains. It stays. And those who walk there now, whether they pray or not, still lower their voices, still look upward, still pause. Outside the city, the roads that once led to Constantinople have become part of other empires, other nations, other stories. But their orientation remains. So many paths of thought and faith and law still bend toward Byzantium, not because it controls them, but because it once carried them with such care. The Renaissance painters who turned their eyes to light, the codifiers of law in universities far from Anatolia, the monks preserving Homer and Plato during Western chaos, all drank, knowingly or not, from Byzantine wells. And though those wells have long been covered over, their water remains in the soil. The soil of history is rarely clean. Byzantium, like any great civilization, bore its share of cruelty, of corruption, of human contradiction. There were betrayals, injustices, blind corners, but these do not erase its gift. They shape it, because what makes Byzantium sacred is not that it was perfect, but that it sought across centuries, through decay, through reform, through resurgence, to tether the human to the eternal, not by force, not always by brilliance, but by rhythm, by repetition, by the belief that if one sings the same hymn long enough, even in a dying voice, the soul will remember, and the soul has remembered. In the hearts of those who still light candles before the same icons, in the eyes of those who still read psalms in the tongues of their ancestors, in the hands of artists who paint not for praise, but for presence, in the spaces between moments where silence gathers and does not feel empty, but full. This is Byzantium now, a tone, a texture, a thread in the fabric of quiet things, and perhaps that is what the world needs most of all, not more noise, not more conquest, but the stillness Byzantium once carried, the sense that time could be curved gently, that walls could be built to sing, that every action from lighting a lamp to placing a tile could be an act of devotion, that beauty, even when unseen, is worth the labor, that faith, even when faltering, is worth the gesture. So if you find yourself in an old place, a monastery perched on a cliff, a church filled with dust motes and silence, a library that smells of paper and wax, listen, not for words, but for that hum beneath everything, that soft reminder that something sacred once passed through here and chose not to shout, but to remain. And in that remaining, Byzantium lives. Sometimes, when dusk drapes itself across the shoulders of the city and the first lights begin to flicker in the windows of hillside homes, you might find yourself pausing in a narrow lane where stone walls rise close and vines crawl along forgotten edges. And in that pause, gentle, involuntary something from deep time brushes past, not a memory you can name, not a figure you can place, but a presence, a hush, a quiet pressure on the air that feels older than speech. You're not alone in that moment, even if no one else is there. It is the atmosphere of Byzantium not visible, but felt, like the scent of myrrh long after the censer has cooled. You realize the wall beside you is older than it seems, that the step you stand on may have been carved when silk first arrived from the east, that beneath your feet, layers of cobblestone hide the bones of temples and chapels and the footprints of thousands who walked before you, monks, masons, messengers, and the silent watchers of time. They left no voice, and yet you can hear them in the stones. Byzantium never vanished. It simply sank lower into the foundation of things. It became the subtext of every sacred silence, and the silence was sacred. In a world that now fills its hours with sound and movement and blinking lights, Byzantium moved more slowly. Its time was not measured in minutes, but in liturgical seasons, in the long ache of Lent, in the golden joy of Pascha, in the solemn rising of feasts like towers in the year. The people were not rushing. They were repeating, remembering, reenacting. Life itself became a kind of sacred drama, each act lit by candlelight, each scene framed in incense. A child's first step was marked not merely with joy, but with prayer. A baker's bread bore a cross not out of habit, but out of offering. Even the making of olive oil became an act of generosity toward both body and spirit. The empire's strength lay not in its armies, though they were many, but in the way ordinary people bound their lives to the holy, until no seam could be seen between labor and liturgy. Nowhere was this seamlessness clearer than in the monasteries. High upon crags where wind sculpted stone into silence, and deep in valleys where brooks whispered through olive groves, men and women chose a life of stillness, not out of rejection of the world, but in order to embrace it more clearly. They farmed. Yes, they copied manuscripts, certainly, but above all, they listened. They became attuned to the soundlessness between sounds, the pause between the bell and the chant, the hush that falls after the final word of a psalm. In these gaps, they heard the eternal, and through them, Byzantium breathed. The empire supported its monks not as distant curiosities, but as vital organs of its body. Emperors would write to abbots for advice. Generals would kneel for blessings before battle, Even as politics turned and dynasties shifted, the monasteries remained steady, their rhythm untouched by the tides of courtly intrigue. And yet, Byzantium was never frozen in time. It evolved, it absorbed, it adapted. It took from the Persians, the Arabs, the Slavs not to mimic, but to refine. Each influence was like a thread woven into an already rich tapestry. New motifs emerged, styles changed, but the spirit held. The churches grew taller, the chants more complex, the icons more tender. In this, Byzantium demonstrated a rare kind of resilience, not resistance to change, but the ability to hold the soul of its identity steady while the surface shifted. It was not afraid of transformation. It welcomed it, as long as the center was protected. That center was not geography. It was not even Constantinople itself, though she was beloved. It was the unseen truth that beauty, rightly shaped, could carry the weight of eternity. So when the final century came, when the empire had shrunk to a few scattered territories, when the city's walls had begun to buckle under siege and sorrow, that center still glowed, diminished, yes, but undimmed. Constantine XV, the last emperor, knew he was walking toward an end. He knew the enemy beyond the walls was vast, clever, unstoppable, but he walked with dignity, with gravity, not as a king clinging to a throne, but as a man bearing the last torch of a 1,000-year-old procession. In the final days, he stripped away ceremony. He knelt beside peasants. He worshipped among citizens who no longer had gold, but still had tears. And when the gates finally burst open, and the tide of Mehmed's armies poured in, Constantine disappeared into the streets sword in hand, not to survive, but to belong to the moment that would close the book. His body was never found, his tomb never marked, but his gesture, that final refusal to flee, became legend. A flame passed into memory, and so the city fell, but it did not vanish. The conquerors, though different in faith and language, recognized something sacred in the bones of the place. They preserved much. Hagia Sophia was not demolished. It was transformed, yes, but with respect. Minarets rose beside the dome. The mosaics were hidden, not destroyed. The rhythm of prayer continued, now in Arabic instead of Greek, but still directed toward the divine. In this strange continuity, Byzantium remained, not visibly, but in atmosphere, in shape, in the way the light still entered at the same angle, in the way the dome still seemed to hover, weightless, above the prayers of the faithful. And the Byzantines, those who survived, carried the fire. Some fled to Italy, carrying manuscripts that would spark the Renaissance. Some fled to Russia, where the idea of Third Rome took root, and the Byzantine eagle spread its wings again. Though in colder skies, some stayed, changed names, changed tongues, but not memories. Grandparents told stories that outlived the words they were spoken in. Mothers lit candles before icons wrapped in cloth. Even when such acts were forbidden or forgotten, Byzantium was not a monument. It was a manner, a tone, a way of turning toward the world with reverence, of arranging the day not by the clock but by the liturgy, of speaking with fewer words and more presence. That manner lingers still. You can feel it in the quiet of certain churches, in the warmth of certain voices, in the shimmer of certain images that never seem quite flat. You can see it in the way a hand moves to bless bread, or how silence is held just a second longer in the middle of a song. Byzantium is no longer a place on a map, but it is still a home for those who seek what is slow, what is sacred, what is shaped with care. It asks nothing. It invites. It opens a door in the middle of a world rushing toward its own noise. And inside that door, there is only a flickering light, a scent of beeswax and stone, and a stillness that says, "Come in, be whole, be quiet." And so it lives, in absence, in presence, in the long memory of the world. There are places where time becomes gentle, where it does not rush, does not divide, does not crack the world into yesterday and today, but instead folds moments together like silk layered in a cedar chest. Byzantium was such a place. Even now, centuries after the banners were torn down, after the walls were breached and the throne stood empty, Its rhythm can still be heard beneath the clutter of the modern world like a distant lullaby sung by someone who no longer remembers the words, but still remembers the tune. It moves not through dates or facts, but through feeling, through a certain slowness in the way a prayer is whispered at a threshold, or in the measured pace of a pilgrim walking beneath cypress trees, not looking for miracles, but for memory. For Byzantium was not just history, it was mood, tone, texture, a way of holding the world, of making space for mystery. It was the space between notes in a chant, the pause between the swinging of an incense burner and the moment the scent reaches the last row of the nave. It was silence curated like sculpture. It taught not through declarations, but through impressions. That impression remains. Though the empire's physical territories have long been absorbed by other powers and other names, the impressions of Byzantium are scattered across the landscape like the shadows of clouds drifting slowly over stone. You see it in a curve of a dome in Ravenna, in the rhythm of footsteps climbing the steep lanes of Mount Athos, in the way a candle flickers in a church carved into the cliffs of Cappadocia. These are not relics. They are echoes not faint, but softened by time. When a deacon lifts a censer and the silver bells chime softly against the chains, the sound might be modern, but the gesture is ancient. The wrist that swings it is the latest in a lineage of thousands, each one trained not just in practice, but in presence. That's what Byzantium cultivated: presence, the ability to inhabit a moment so completely that even the ordinary becomes holy. And it was in the ordinary that the extraordinary was kept alive. Byzantium, though filled with emperors and theologians, was not only made of courts and councils, it was made of kitchens, gardens, workshops, and marketplaces, places where the sacred met the mundane in daily contact. In a bakery where loaves were stamped with the seal of Christ before baking, in a weaver's loom strung with threads dyed in the colors of feast days, in a potter's hands shaping vessels for both oil and anointing. These were the places where the empire's soul lingered longest, not in declarations, but in details. A particular shade of blue used for the virgin's robe, a certain order of vowels in a psalmic chant, a ritual kiss given before lighting a lamp. It was in the details that Byzantium's eternity nested. Even the empire's decline did not erase this. In fact, it sharpened it. As political power waned and the imperial court grew smaller, as fortresses fell and provinces vanished, the people turned ever more to these interior spaces, to the monastery, the liturgy, the home. They prayed more, not less. They painted richer icons, not poorer. They held their traditions not with clenched fists, but with open, weathered palms, knowing that time might take everything except the spirit with which things were done, and that spirit, tender and enduring, passed from generation to generation like a soft light cupped in careful hands. That light still shines, not brightly, but steadily. It does not blind. It illuminates, and sometimes, even now, it surprises. A scholar in a university library may open a Byzantine manuscript, crisp pages, delicate ink, and feel the hush of a monk's breath across the parchment. A tourist may wander into an old chapel on a Greek island, empty except for birds and light, and feel their chest tighten without knowing why. A child may stand before an icon, its face calm and golden, and feel a question settle in the quiet space behind their eyes. These are not accidents. They are visitations. Byzantium doesn't need to be summoned. It waits, not in monuments alone, but in gestures, in how a cloth is folded, in how a name is spoken, in how a silence is kept. The West, in its haste and noise, often misunderstood this. It looked at Byzantium and saw complication, a hierarchy, formality. It did not always see the love beneath the form, but form was never the point. It was the vessel. Byzantium's ceremonies were not about performance. They were about containment, about holding something too vast for words in the frame of repetition, rhythm, and reverence. It was not perfection they sought, but devotion. And even when devotion faltered, when emperors fell into cruelty, when bishops betrayed their flocks, when people forgot the prayers and simply went through the motions the forms held, and within those forms, the sacred could return. That was Byzantium's genius. It trusted the shape of things to carry their meaning forward. even when the hearts that performed them grew weary. Like a melody remembered by the body, even when the mind forgets the song. And what of now? The empire is gone. The double-headed eagle no longer flies above the city of Constantine. The emperor's names are remembered more by scholars than by common tongues. And yet, if you sit in a church where the liturgy has not changed for 1,000 years, you will feel it. Not the empire, but the presence. You will feel it in the slow unfolding of words sung in a mode that resists haste. You will feel it in the candles burning low, each flame a voice raised in silence. You will feel it in the hand that crosses itself not out of habit, but out of longing. Byzantium is not the past. It is the thread of gold stitched quietly into the fabric of the now. It does not ask for attention. It only asks that you be still, because in stillness, it appears. In the way a priest places the bread on the altar, like laying down his own breath. In the moment before the gospel is read, when the air seems to hold itself, in the slight tremble of an elder's voice reciting a prayer he has known since boyhood, in the breath between Lord, have mercy and the next beat. Byzantium is there, in those small deep spaces where the soul listens best. And if you listen, truly listen not with the ear, but with the space behind the eyes, the space in the chest where silence lives, you may find yourself not transported, but grounded, not removed from the present, but returned to it more fully. Byzantium never tried to lift people out of the world. It tried to teach them to see the world as holy. That is the real miracle. That is what endures. So let the empire fade. Let the names of emperors crumble like old marble. Let the maps change. But do not let the tone disappear. Do not lose the way the light moved through that dome. Do not lose the hush that fell when the gospel was lifted. Do not lose the way the old woman crossed herself before stepping into the street. Because in these, the empire was never about power. It was always about presence. There's a peculiar way in which certain things become more vivid in their absence. Not louder, not more defined, but more present, like a scent remembered after the flowers have gone. Byzantium has become such a thing. With each century that has passed since its last emperor vanished into the smoke of a broken gate, its presence has not diminished, but diffused. It clings to the spaces between what is known and what is felt, between the scholarly and the sacred. No longer an empire, no longer a polity or a crown. It has become a current soft, slow, and ceaseless running beneath the surface of modern life. You do not see it unless you slow down, unless you listen not only with your ears, but with your stillness. And in that stillness, you begin to notice how Byzantium continues to sing not in trumpets or declarations, but in low tones that curve beneath conversation, in melodies that surface only when the day has grown quiet and the shadows long. You find it in places you never thought to look, in the way a robe falls on the shoulder of a monk walking beneath pine trees, in the curve of a dome glimpsed between apartment buildings, in the way a child's voice stumbles through the first notes of a hymn older than any kingdom still standing. These are not survivals. They are continuations, because Byzantium never placed its eternity in monuments alone. It placed it in rhythms, in habits passed like heirlooms, in cadences too soft to shatter. It trusted the body to remember what the mind might one day forget. It taught that if you walked the same path, knelt in the same way, sang the same words, then, even when the palace fell, the kingdom would remain, not in marble, in motion. And so it has, in the slowness of liturgy, in the patience of icons, in the turning of the church year, like an ancient clock that does not rush and does not falter. These rhythms, repeated without explanation, shape the soul as stone shapes the river. And though the world has changed, though empires have risen and fallen, though modernity has etched itself across every surface, that river still runs. Step into an Orthodox church, anywhere, and feel it. The door closes behind you, and suddenly the light is different. It does not strike, it hovers. Candles flicker, incense curls in long, slow breaths. There is no rush, there is only presence. The walls, though perhaps newly painted, echo the same proportions that once curved through the heart of Constantinople. The icons, perhaps local, perhaps centuries old, carry the same gaze not at you, but through you. And the chants, low and layered, weave themselves not as performance, but as invitation. No one explains. They simply begin, and in that beginning, the empire that once stretched from the Adriatic to the Euphrates unfolds again not in conquest, but in calm. And calm, truly, is Byzantium's inheritance. Not serenity in the absence of sorrow, but serenity shaped through it. This was an empire that knew suffering, that felt siege and famine, betrayal and exile, plague and fire, and yet it did not collapse into despair. It turned inward not into isolation, but into contemplation, into a deeper understanding of what can be held, even when much is lost. It found, in repetition, a kind of healing, not the healing of erasure, but of integration, of placing pain where it belongs in the story, but not letting it define the whole. A city burned, a church was rebuilt, an emperor died, a prayer was sung. The pattern continued, always with grief, always with grace, and because of that grace, Byzantium has remained a lantern in the long corridor of time. For those who seek certainty, it offers little, but for those who seek depth, it offers everything. It reminds us that holiness is not always felt in thunder, but often in the pause before a word. That beauty is not always seen in grandeur, but in the soft gleam of oil on a priest's hands, as he blesses bread no richer than the lives of those who baked it. That faith is not always shouted, but sometimes simply endured. The Byzantines knew how to endure. They built cathedrals with no promise that the world would understand them. They wrote hymns with no guarantee they would be sung. They painted icons not for galleries, but for walls that might one day crumble. And in doing so, they left behind not only artifacts, but a way of seeing, a way of living, as if the sacred were always near. That nearness, that whisper of divinity, is perhaps Byzantium's most haunting legacy, not because it demands anything, but because it lingers. It lingers in a single note of chant, held longer than necessary, in a floor swept before dawn, in a priest's quiet bow before the altar when no one is watching. These acts, so small, become enormous in their intention. They do not strive, they reveal. Byzantium was never in a hurry. It did not rush to prove. It waited, trusted, allowed the slow unfolding of understanding across generations. And so it remains a teacher of slowness in an age of acceleration. There are those who ask what Byzantium accomplished, what it left, what legacy it built in architecture, politics, diplomacy, and answers can be given: the preservation of Roman law, the transmission of Greek thought, the shaping of Eastern Christian tradition. But these are only the visible things. The true legacy is subtler. It is the ability to step out of the noise, to enter a space shaped by centuries of attention, and to be changed not by what you learn, but by how you are held in light, in sound, in silence. Byzantium does not instruct, it enfolds, and for those who have never known it, never walked beneath its arches, never stood in the soft gloom of a liturgical morning, it still calls, not with urgency, but with longing, a longing not to return, but to remember how to breathe more slowly, to listen more deeply, to move with more intention. For Byzantium, in the end, was not only a place, it was a practice, and in that practice lies its immortality. So let the towers fall, let the capitals erode, let the scrolls fade. What was truly Byzantine was never only in the stones. It was in the way time curved beneath them, in the way the people moved through it, in the way they carried the eternal in vessels so humble they could be mistaken for everyday life. But they were not really. They were acts of gold, shaped in dust, and because they were shaped in dust, they have lasted, still, here. In the long hush of early morning, when the first light brushes the rooftops and the minarets cast long shadows over streets still heavy with sleep, the presence of Byzantium rises quietly, not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as a rhythm returning to itself. It is in the soft clatter of wooden shutters being opened, in the low creak of a door that might once have been part of a church, a hospice, a merchant's villa. It is in the cobblestones worn smooth, not just by traffic, but by centuries of repetition, by barefoot monks, by emperors in golden sandals, by merchants leading donkeys laden with silk, oil, salt, and stories. It is not romantic. It is not tragic. It is simply real as the rising of bread, the lighting of lamps, the drawing of breath before a hymn begins. Byzantium was never a museum. It was a living texture, and that texture still lingers in the folds of the world, not whole, not pristine, but alive in the way that all things become more alive after breaking, when the pieces are gathered with care and placed not where they once were, but where they belong now. Because Byzantium was never about permanence. It was about attention. It taught the world not how to last forever, but how to last well, how to carry what matters, and let go of what does not. It refined itself over centuries, paring away the unnecessary, carving its faith into icons and verses and gestures that could pass through fire and still shine. Its people knew how to kneel, not just in churches, but in kitchens. They knew how to wait through sieges, through droughts, through long Lenten seasons when hope dimmed and the sky stayed gray. They practiced faith not as spectacle, but as a steady thread woven into the mundane. Their glory was not in conquest, it was in constancy, and that constancy left behind a shape the world still turns toward, often without realizing it. A shape of reverence, of movement that does not draw attention, but draws the eye to something beyond itself. You see it in the domes, not built to impress, but to invite. Domes that curve like the sky itself, drawing the gaze upward and inward in the same motion. You see it in the mosaic's faces made of glass and stone and gold, not to mimic human flesh, but to reflect divine light. You see it in the layout of a church, where every path leads toward the altar, not in a straight line, but in a spiral of meaning, of approach, of preparation. Byzantium was not linear. It moved in circles, in cycles, in returns. It believed in the wisdom of repetition, that truth was not in novelty, but in depth, that a prayer said 1,000 times was not worn, but ripened. And so it built not for the eye alone, but for the soul. It shaped space the way poets shape silence, not to fill, but to frame. And in those spaces, people lived lives that were ordinary and extraordinary all at once. A fisherman casting nets into the Bosphorus as the bells rang for matins. A widow placing a coin at the foot of a saint's icon. A soldier praying for peace with hands still scarred from battle. Byzantium held them all. It did not erase their struggle. It gave it shape. It gave it language. Even in loss, it offered a kind of clarity, a sense that the world was more than what could be seen, more than what could be counted. And so, when the empire lost its provinces, its treasures, its armies, it still kept its soul, because that soul was never built on victory. It was built on meaning. Meaning was Byzantium's true export, not just silk and spices, not just law and art, but a way of seeing the world as suffused with the sacred, a way of walking through time with reverence, a way of knowing that beauty is not frivolous, but essential, that it shapes the heart, and the heart shapes everything. This was what the empire gave to the lands it touched, not just architecture, not just theology, but a kind of interior elegance, a quiet dignity that taught people how to live slowly, how to bow their heads before mystery, how to find joy not only in feasts, but in fasts, how to stand inside a space filled with gold and still feel humility, how to become small without becoming lost. And that humility, that willingness to be part of something greater, older, more mysterious, was Byzantium's secret strength. Its people did not always understand everything they sang, or painted, or recited, but they trusted the form, they trusted the silence. They knew that to stand in a liturgy was not to be entertained, but to be entered, that to light a candle was not to ask for something, but to offer something, that to gaze at an icon was not to admire it, but to be seen by it. In this trust, Byzantium flourished, not always in gold, often in quiet, often in the flicker of light on a wall that no longer bore a name, but still bore grace. Even now, there are walls like that, in villages where only elders remember the old chants, inside chapels where the paint has peeled, but the pattern remains, in manuscripts where the ink has faded, but the hand that wrote it still speaks through the curve of each letter. These remnants do not ask to be restored. They ask to be noticed, to be honored, to be read not with the eyes, but with the heart. Because Byzantium, in the end, was not about what could be shown. It was about what could be carried. And the world does carry it. In monasteries that rise like bones from the earth, in prayers whispered in languages few understand, in gestures that have survived because they are beautiful, and because they work, because they still hold. Byzantium's survival was never assured, but its legacy was. It was built too deeply, planted too carefully. Its roots went into the silence beneath the stone, into the pauses between words, into the waiting that shapes all true reverence. So now, as the modern world races ever faster, as screens glow and clocks blink, and time is carved into fragments too small to feel, Byzantium waits. It does not chase, it does not demand. It stands like an icon in a quiet chapel, still, radiant, patient. It knows that those who need it will find it, that those who seek something more than noise, more than novelty, will one day step into a space shaped by chant and shadow and gold, and know they are home. Because Byzantium is not gone, it is simply farther in. There are endings that feel abrupt, and there are endings that feel inevitable, like the last note of a chant fading into vaulted air, or the closing of a great book whose final page is not a conclusion, but a return to silence. Byzantium's ending was this second kind. It didn't crash or shatter. It receded, slowly, carefully, almost ceremonially, as if it had known all along that its shape was too fine, too intricate, to last forever in the visible world. But what it left behind was not absence, it was resonance, like a bell that, once struck, continues to vibrate long after the hammer has been laid down. Like breath lingering in the cold stillness of a chapel, that resonance is still with us. It lives in the architecture of thought. It lives in the architecture of worship. It lives in the human longing for rhythm, beauty, and meaning, for a life shaped not by utility alone, but by attention. Byzantium was nothing if not attentive. Every gesture, every stone, every syllable was placed with care, not to impress, to sanctify, to remind the soul that it lives not only in the body, but also in time. And time, in Byzantium, was not a straight road, it was a spiral. The past was never left behind. It was carried forward, circled back upon, re-entered through prayer and feast and fast. The future was not a conquest, it was a returning, a homecoming. This is why the fall of Constantinople in 1453 did not break that spiral. It only folded it deeper inward. The city changed hands. The rites changed languages. The crosses were replaced with crescents, but the rhythm, somehow, continued. The city still paused at dawn, still listened at dusk, still gave space to silence. Even those who conquered it felt its weight, its mystery. They did not level Hagia Sophia, they entered it in awe. For even victors must bow before what has endured longer than empires, the sacred shaped in stone. This is what Byzantium understood, that empires of territory pass, but empires of attention remain. The true city was never just the walls or the throne. It was the gestures, the way a priest bowed his head before opening the gospel, the way a widow lit a candle for someone long dead but never lost, the way children learned to cross themselves by watching their grandmothers, mimicking reverence before they even knew its meaning. Byzantium was not a place you merely lived in. It was a way of living through time, through loss, through wonder. And that way lives on in Orthodox churches from Moscow to Cairo, in libraries in Venice, in the dreams of artists who still reach for that unnameable glow, that Byzantine gold, which was never about wealth, but about light made soft and holy. To speak of Byzantium now is not to grieve it. It is to listen for it, because it is still speaking in the hush between notes of a liturgical hymn, in the silence of an icon's gaze, in the cool breath of ancient stone touched by candlelight. It speaks in the way a building leans into symmetry, not for pride, but for peace, in the way language holds onto certain words because no other can replace them, in the way ritual draws us back not to obligation, but to a quiet recognition we have been here before, we will be here again. The Byzantines knew the soul is not shaped by novelty, it is shaped by the return. And so they returned, again and again, to the same prayers, the same psalms, the same processions, not out of ignorance, but out of trust, that through repetition we are refined, that through rhythm we are revealed. In this they were unlike any other empire. They did not seek to change the world. They sought to sanctify it, to lift it, not into heaven, but into awareness, into presence, into a mode of being where even the most ordinary acts, sweeping a floor, baking bread, bowing one's head, became part of a long and luminous conversation with the sacred. And because of that, the loss of their borders didn't mean the loss of their essence. Byzantium became portable, transmissible. It entered the bloodstream of history like a quiet perfume. You cannot see it, but you know when it's near. It's near in a liturgy sung by candlelight in a remote village. It's near in the silence that falls before a final blessing. It's near in the echo of footsteps through a cloister. It's near when a mosaic, chipped and half forgotten, still turns its gaze toward the east. Byzantium is not in the museums. It is in the movement, in the way something ancient stirs when we stop rushing, when we sit long enough to hear the breath beneath the world, when we realize that holiness does not announce itself, it accumulates, slowly, like wax on stone, like time layered in chant, and it will continue, because the human soul, no matter how distracted, still longs for the shape Byzantium offered, not dominance, but dignity, not speed, but sacred slowness, not spectacle, but the subtle radiance of things done well, done carefully, done with the knowledge that what we shape shapes us in return. This is Byzantium's gift, not a lesson, but a presence, not a system, but a soul, not a warning, but a warmth. And now, as the modern world rushes forward, as screens flicker and noise fills every corner, that warmth remains, waiting, not demanding to be remembered, but ready to be re-entered. The chant has not ended. The silence has not emptied. The golden light still falls on stone somewhere, and someone, maybe an old monk, maybe a child, still bows before it without needing to know why. That gesture is enough. That gesture is Byzantium. It does not ask for praise. It only asks that we slow down, that we listen, that we remember how to see. And now, the story grows quiet, like a candle reaching its final inch of wax. The flame softens, steadies, and begins to lean toward stillness. Byzantium, once a city of gold, of processions, of whispered prayers in the dark, no longer walks in the world as it once did, but its breath remains. In some corner of the soul, lit softly by memory, it remains, not as nostalgia, not as sorrow, but as a still but low presence, like a hush just before dawn, like light resting on ancient stone. Its music doesn't need to continue to be heard. It only needs to have been sung. Its prayers don't need to echo through cathedrals to be alive. They live in the hands that have touched the same walls, walked the same floors, bowed in the same way, even centuries later. That's what Byzantium gave: a rhythm that doesn't end, a beauty that doesn't age, a presence that doesn't fade. It did not shout its legacy. It whispered it into the corners of the world, where it took root in shadow, in silence, in sacred repetition. And now, as your eyes begin to grow heavier, as your breath falls into the gentle rhythm of sleep, know that this story, this quiet arc across centuries, asks nothing more of you, only that you rest, only that you let the golden domes drift behind your thoughts like clouds, and the echo of chants roll softly beneath your dreams. The empire is gone, but its hush remains. Its light still flickers in the spaces we make for stillness. Let it keep watch now. Let it stand beside you in the quiet night.